Hey guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're standing in a medieval village, or maybe a chilly stone castle, wondering how to find love. Maybe strike up a conversation. Compliment someone's house. Ask if they come here often. No, that's not how any of this works. If you're in the Middle Ages, dating in the modern sense doesn't really exist. You don't flirt, text, or go for long walks to see where it goes. Instead, your parents, or your lord, or your abbot are already deciding who you'll marry, when, and how many cows it will take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've probably been betrothed since before your voice dropped. You and your future spouse might meet for the first time on your wedding day. And yes, that's just as uncomfortable as it sounds. The whole thing is about land, titles, and family alliances, not compatibility, or how good they are at lute solos. If you're a peasant, things are slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still has a strong say, and love isn't really part of the discussion. Maybe your parents know a nice girl whose family owns a productive goat. Maybe they admire a boy who can thatch a roof without falling off. Boom, you're courting now. Lucky you. It's not that people in the Middle Ages didn't feel romantic. They do. It's just not the priority. The goal is survival, inheritance, and social stability. Falling in love before marriage? That's risky. Falling in love outside of marriage? That's scandalous. Either way, it's frowned upon. Unless you're a character in a tragic poem, in which case go wild. And yet you dream. Maybe you write a little verse on a scrap of parchment. Maybe you sneak a glance across the market. Maybe, just maybe, you fall for someone who wasn't pre-approved by your family's livestock appraiser. But for now, you wait. You obey. You try not to fall for the miller's apprentice. Because in this world, love might be the goal of poets, but marriage is the work of parents, priests, and politics. So you think someone's cute. Maybe it's the way they balance a basket of onions on their head. Maybe it's the confident way they beat mud off a rug. Your medieval heart skips a beat. But steady yourself, because in this world, romance doesn't bloom without a balance sheet. Before you even think about courtship, you better ask, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is a charming personality, you might want to sit down. If you're a young man, you'll need land or livestock or tools or a roof that doesn't leak too much. Love letters are nice, but nothing says husband material like 2 healthy oxen and a roof that can survive a mild storm. If your father has already promised the best goat to your brother, well, you might want to consider the priesthood. If you're a young woman, your family needs a dowry that could be coin, clothing, or a suspiciously generous number of geese. Doesn't matter how witty you are. If your family can't pay up, you're likely to spend a long time perfecting your embroidery alone. Now let's say you actually like someone who makes your calloused heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It's romantic. It's poetic. It's completely irrelevant because unless your families are on equal financial footing, you might as well fall in love with a cloud. If you're noble, it gets worse. Your hand in marriage is tied to land, borders, and political favors. You're not just a person. You're a walking treaty. Congratulations. Even peasants aren't safe. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion. You settle for irrigation rights. And yet you try. Maybe you offer a small gift, a carved spoon, a handful of berries, or your finest, slightly cracked mug. Maybe they smile. Maybe they don't. But the truth remains. In medieval dating, economics is flirting, and love is just a bonus you hope your spouse develops eventually. So let's say you're not a peasant worrying about pigs or a noble dealing with treaties. Let's say you're a knight. Shiny armor, big horse, questionable poetry skills. What's your love life like? Welcome to the strange and emotionally exhausting world of courtly love now. This isn't dating. This is performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime, part flirting, part spiritual suffering, and entirely impractical. You, the brave knight, choose a noble lady, usually one who's already married, and vow to adore her from afar. Not physically, of course. That would ruin everything. No, you're supposed to suffer elegantly. You might compose a few tortured verses about her silver laugh, or how her hair burns like the sun, which in medieval terms means she has hair and didn't insult your family. You wear her colors at tournaments. You pine, you say. You occasionally joust someone just because he glanced at her too long. The lady's role. She's supposed to pretend this is all very flattering, while maintaining a level of icy detachment that would terrify a glacier. She may respond with a letter, a token, maybe a ribbon, but mostly she'll just be mysterious and unattainable, which is the entire point. The emotions are high, the actual contact, minimal. At best, you might get a nod from across the hall, or a finger brushed against your gauntlet during a feast. Anything more. And suddenly it's not courtly love. It's a scandal. Or worse, adultery. And no one wants that, at least not officially. This entire setup worked best when everyone involved agreed it was mostly pretend. It was a way to express longing, devotion, and creative angst, all without disrupting the social order. A medieval venting mechanism, if you will. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. Did it involve more poetry than practicality? Constantly. But for a knight stuck between battles and boredom, courtly love gave you something to write about and someone to write for. Just don't expect a happy ending, or a kiss, or even eye contact. So you've fallen for someone. Great. Now comes the hard part, expressing that affection in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone is basically a declaration of war. Welcome to the medieval solution. Tokens. Think of it as 12th century texting, slow, confusing, and open to wildly inaccurate interpretation. Let's say you're a knight and you're hopelessly in love with Lady Marjorie, or whatever her last name is. You can't speak to her alone, and your poems keep getting intercepted by her confessor. What do? You send her a glove? Or maybe your embroidered sleeve. Nothing says I love you like mailing someone part of your wardrobe. And if you're on the receiving end, congratulations. You now have a sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, and the romantic burden of pretending you know what it means. Is he confessing love? Asking for a favor? Suggesting a duel? Who knows? Women gave tokens too. A ribbon, a piece of hair, a tiny pendant. It was sentimental, sure, but also deeply strategic. Give the wrong guy the wrong token, and suddenly you're spoken for. By someone with a lazy eye and a drinking problem. Tokens were meant to be subtle. A glove pinned to your chest, a ribbon tied to your sword hilt. Everyone knew what it meant, and no one said what it meant. The more cryptic, the better. It was less about communication and more about plausible deniability. Oh, this glove? No, it's not from Lady Joan. It just appeared on my pillow, scented with lavender. Completely random. For commoners, tokens were simpler. Maybe a wood carving, maybe a handkerchief you stitched when you weren't milking something. It was still romantic, just with more calluses involved. Tokens were also risky. Giving one to the wrong person could spark rumors. Receiving one you didn't want meant figuring out how to politely return someone's sock without insulting their lineage. But for all the awkwardness, these tokens carried real emotional weight. They were symbols of love in a world that didn't allow much room for it. So you finally build up the courage to talk to your crush. Maybe offer them a flower. Maybe quote a little bad poetry you definitely didn't steal from a traveling minstrel. You're ready for a moment of intimacy. Unfortunately, you're not alone. Welcome to the world of medieval dating surveillance, where love is never blind. It's heavily monitored by your mother, your priest, a nosy cousin, and sometimes all three at once. Let's say you're a young woman of marrying age. You're never just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with Margaret and her terrifyingly strict aunt, who's already judging your posture. Even if you're simply fetching water, someone is watching. Someone is always watching. It's less dating, more espionage. And if you're a man trying to court someone, better hope you have the approval of her family, her parish priest, and the local gossip network. You show up at her house with flowers. Her father's behind the door, sharpening something. Her mother's pretending to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours, and the village priest just happens to be passing by on his way to morning prayers at sunset. The logic behind all this supervision was simple. Protect virtue, preserve family honor, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage, especially alone, especially ever. Chaperones were there to monitor innocent interactions, group outings, monitored walks, supervised, sitting within a 2-meter radius of each other on a bench. Only if someone's grandmother is knitting nearby and pretending not to listen. The church, of course, had opinions. Lots of them. It regulated courtship the way a bouncer regulates a nightclub. Priests gave sermons about proper conduct and wrote lengthy treatises on the dangers of flirtation. Yes, that's right. Medieval clergy published anti-flirting manuals. Imagine someone copying those out by candlelight while monks silently judge you from across the scriptorium. Even letter writing wasn't safe. Some monasteries opened love letters just to screen for moral content. That's right, divine censorship. So if you want to fall in love, you'll have to get used to doing it quietly and in the presence of your entire extended family and possibly God. So you're in love, or at least medieval in love, which is mostly longing, confusion, and a lot of pacing near windows. You exchange glances across a feast. Maybe they picked up your dropped handkerchief and didn't immediately throw it into the fire. The tension is unbearable, but you still can't speak freely. There are chaperones, priests, mothers lurking like emotional border patrol agents. So what do you write a letter? Yes, the secret love letter. The most dangerous piece of parchment since the excommunication notice. This is your chance to confess your heart, using the most cryptic, overly poetic language possible. Because you can't just say, "I like you." You must say, "My soul is a stag, pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning." Naturally, if you're literate, which, let's be honest, isn't a given, you pen your message on vellum or rough parchment. If you're really dedicated, you dust it with flower petals or perfume. Just be careful with that. One noble accidentally used a love letter to wrap a herring and delivered it to the wrong girl. They're married now. It's fine. Now comes the problem of delivery. You can't just hand it over. You need a courier, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling with limited understanding of consequences. Sometimes even a minstrel would do the job, singing your poem in the town square while pretending it was anonymous. Subtle. And the poetry. Risky. Very risky. The line between romantic and heresy was thinner than a monk's patience during Lent. If your metaphor even hinted at anything physical, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary exaggeration. But despite all the rules, people did write. Some letters survived. Some poems were copied and passed around like forbidden fruit in a world of rigid roles and constant supervision. A folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. So you're right. You risk it. You press your trembling hand to the parchment and say everything you can't say aloud. Just don't sign it too clearly. You want romance, not a church trial. Finally, a break, a feast day, a harvest festival, a maypole dance. In short, a rare moment when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not interested in the blacksmith's daughter today. You're allowed to flirt. Sort of. As long as no one sees. Or everyone sees, but pretends not to. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blooms under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met in Three Chickens. Festivals were one of the few socially approved moments when men and women could mingle, laugh, and, dare we say, make eye contact. There's music, there's ale. There's someone wearing a flower crown with dangerous confidence. You've never seen so many people not pretending to be miserable. If you're a peasant, you might try to impress your crush by winning the sack race, catching a greased pig, or juggling 3 stale rolls of bread. Nothing says I'm available like falling off a hay bale with dignity. Dancing was your best shot at actual physical contact. The rules were rigid, but a well-timed spin, or a not quite accidental hand graze could say more than any poem. The maypole dance, for example, was basically a giant excuse for coordinated flirtation wrapped in ribbons and plausible deniability. And if you're noble, your version of flirting at a festival involves less hay, and more poetry. You might compose a verse on the spot, compare your lady's eyes to twin candles or other glowing things, and offer a trinket. Hopefully not one that was clearly made by your servant 5 minutes earlier. Food helped too. Offer your beloved a meat pie or share a honey cake. If they accept it with a smile, you're doing well. If they hand it to their dog, start over with someone else. But remember, everything you do, someone is watching. A parent, a priest, a bar with a big mouth, one misstep, and your flirty smile becomes a youthful indiscretion. Discussed at church for the next 6 weeks. Still, for a few hours, you can pretend. Pretend you're in a world where love isn't a transaction, where laughter isn't suspicious, and where dancing in public doesn't end in penance. Let's say you're not a knight, a noble, or a bard with lute and excessive feelings. You're a regular villager. You wake up with the cows, go to bed with the chickens, and spend most of your day ankle deep in mud. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without emotional drama. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we can survive winter together. In your world, dating is less about long conversations and more about shared tasks. You notice someone you like because they work hard, don't complain much, and have a decent set of teeth. That's it. That's the whole checklist. You're not picky. You're realistic. You don't need fireworks. You need someone who can gut a fish and maybe doesn't snore too loudly. So, how do you show interest? You give gifts. Small, useful things. A basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a good turnip. And if you're feeling bold, maybe a woven ribbon or a carved spoon. Nothing says I'm serious about you. Like a spoon you whittle by candlelight while your pig judged you silently. Conversations happen during shared chores. You might walk together to the mill, chat while tending sheep, or exchange pleasantries while shoveling something that smells questionable. No one's reciting poetry. You're talking about the weather, crop yields, and whether or not old Thomas fell in the well again. And yet, in its own way, it's romantic. There's a sweetness in the simplicity, a shared life built not on idealism, but on cooperation. You know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and how fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals often came quickly. If you both agreed, then the families did too. Marriage followed. Maybe you moved into a shared hut. Maybe you built a new one from scratch with help from the village. You brought your best blanket. They brought a goat together. You began the strange miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You've done it. You found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. True love, right? Now it's time to get married, which in medieval terms means you're entering into a contract. Not a dreamy vow under the stars, a legally binding transaction. Often negotiated with all the passion of a livestock auction. If you're a peasant, it's still a big deal. You gather a few witnesses, talk to the local priest, and try not to trip over the Latin during the ceremony. But behind the sweet-sounding blessings is a serious checklist. Dowry, land rights, who gets the cow, and what happens if someone dies during planting season. Yes, romance. If you're from the upper class, buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown legal negotiation. Your parents, their parents, the priest, the scribe, maybe a cousin who once studied law. They're all in on it. The bride and groom mostly just standing nearby, looking decorative and nodding when spoken to. You may or may not have even met the person you're marrying. Your family has done the math. Your estate needs her fields, her dowry balances your debts, and both of your coats of arms look good next to each other. Love is optional. The merger is not. And once you're married, it's permanent. Divorce isn't really a thing unless you can prove someone wasn't baptized, was secretly related to you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments existed, but they required a lot of paperwork, a bit of luck, and a solid bribe. Still, not everything is bleak. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other, shared chores, raising children, surviving winters. These things have a way of building affection, or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is basically the same thing. The church was involved in every step. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the 7 big ones. You didn't just marry for legal reasons. You married because God needed a witness, possibly two. So you stand, exchange vows, and smile as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. So let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're a noble, but for once you want to marry for love. Not for land, not for lineage, not for your father's strategic ambitions. Just love. Congratulations, you're about to cause a scandal. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of lighting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes if you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing. It wasn't just a personal rebellion. It was political sabotage. Let's say your Lady Eleanor promised to be so boring Vaughn estate secure, but you've fallen madly in love with a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. You meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings in the stables, and one day you vanish off to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favor. There you marry under questionable legality, with only a nervous monk and 2 chickens as witnesses. Back at home, chaos your family. Outraged. Your father is threatening to siege the groom's family garden. Your mother is crying into her embroidery hoop. The church, deeply concerned. The gossip, delicious. And if you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case scenario, you get to keep your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case, you are excommunicated and disemboweled in that order. Still, some couples got away with it. If the union couldn't be undone without causing even more embarrassment, families sometimes just sighed and moved on. After all, what's done is done, and at least nobody dies. Hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals became legends. Songs were written, poems composed, stories whispered at banquets, 2 nobles who chose love over duty, practically mythological. And yes, most noble marriages were transactional. But these moments, brief rebellions, passionate escapes, whispered vows beneath moonlit towers, they reminded the world that love, though inconvenient, refused to go extinct. So if you ever feel dramatic for swiping left or turning down a second date, just remember at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, angry barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. A marriage. That beautiful union of 2 souls and their respective financial portfolios. Because in the Middle Ages love was nice, but a dowry? Now that was truly romantic. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married, you're being launched like a small dowry-equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your dowry. Money, livestock, land, linens, a cow or 2, depending on how lovable they think you are. And maybe even a set of pewter dishes if they're feeling generous. These offerings go to your future husband, who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator. Now flip the scenario. In some cultures or regions, it's not the bride's family giving the goods, it's the bride price. The groom pays her family for the honor of marrying her, effectively saying, here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Now give me your daughter. Medieval romance at its finest. The point is, someone is paying someone. You're getting married, and there is absolutely a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about wealth. They were about status, expectations, and public statements. A large dowry might indicate a bride came from a prestigious family. A stingy one might suggest they were trying to offload her quickly, possibly due to suspicious personality traits or a habit of talking back. You, as the bride, didn't usually get to keep your dowry. It became part of the household economy, managed by your husband, guarded by the law, and hopefully not gambled away on dice and ale within the first month of marriage. If the marriage ended through death, annulment, or your husband wandering off to join a monastery after midlife regret, your dowry could theoretically be returned. But retrieving it was often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd need support, legal backing, and ideally someone who could read. Meanwhile, the bride price, if paid, was like buying a rare goat. Expensive up front and no refunds. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labor. After all, who's going to milk the sheep now? So while love was occasionally in the mix, money was always at the altar, so you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son, or your dowry was suspiciously small, or you just really like chanting. Either way, you've joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations. You've now taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet, here you are, in a stone cloister, surrounded by silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Yes, even behind monastery walls, forbidden love found a way. To be clear, falling in love in a religious order was deeply discouraged. Like you might get whipped, exiled, or lectured by someone with a Latin name. Discouraged, you've sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which means giving it to literally no one else. But hearts are unruly, and sometimes prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. Maybe it starts with innocent tasks, passing each other bread in the refectory, whispering during vespers, laughing a little too hard when someone drops a hymnal. Before you know it, you're tucking extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel and questioning everything. Some monks and nuns wrote passionate letters, disguised, of course, as theological musings. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation. Sound holy unless you read between the lines. And many did. There were inevitably scandals, secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. The punishment, usually harsh exile, public penance, or being reassigned to some far-off abbey known mostly for sheep and silence. Still, not all stories ended in disgrace. Some lovers escaped. A few even got married after being defrocked. Most, though, returned to their cloisters, red-faced and re-devoted, swearing that the whole thing was just an overzealous theological debate. Because in the end, monastic life was about discipline. But humans are humans, even in robes, even in silence. And sometimes a quiet glance across the chapel was more thrilling than any tournament or courtly poem. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, a pig roast, and someone spilled meat on your mother's only nice cloak. But now it's been a few months or years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying lute. Maybe they forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or maybe you just realized that marrying for land and sheep doesn't automatically result in romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't go reaching for the divorce papers because they don't exist. At least, not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred and unbreakable bond, approved by the church, sealed by God, and enforced by public shame. You could try for an annulment, but you'd need a very good reason. We don't get along, don't cut it. You'd have to prove that one of you was underage, already married, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often. Or best case scenario, never consummated the marriage, which meant someone had to confirm that fact in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. If you're a noble, it gets messy. Your marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Trying to escape, it could start a feud, ignite a scandal, or launch a minor war. Best to just quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts. So what do unhappy couples do? Mostly, they just endure. You sleep in different beds. You sigh dramatically at dinner. You pour your feelings into embroidery or that one really angry song. Passive aggression becomes your love language. Of course, affairs happened, usually quietly, sometimes spectacularly. Nobles had secret lovers. Peasants had suspiciously helpful neighbors. The church condemned it, of course, but that didn't stop people. It just made them better at sneaking around barns and blaming things on God's mysterious will. For women, getting out of a bad marriage was especially hard. Even if your husband was violent or vanished, society expected you to stay loyal, silent, and mildly pious while surviving off bread crusts and disapproval. Still, some people made it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they could become partnerships, forged by hardship, habit, and the shared experience of hauling firewood in the rain. Let's say your spouse dies. Maybe it was the plague, maybe a farm accident. Maybe they tripped over a goose in the dark. However it happened, you're now widowed and suddenly the medieval dating pool opens back up. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was oddly liberating. Not Do whatever you want, liberating, but certainly more freedom than you had before. For women especially, widowhood often brought a taste of independence, managing land, making decisions, even speaking in public without being immediately shushed. And if you were youngish and still had teeth, you could remarry quickly, very quickly. Mourning periods existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with land and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest. Suitors appeared with alarming speed, some sincere, others just very enthusiastic about her dairy cows. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically pushes you back into marriage. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking. Maybe the baker's daughter, maybe that quiet widow, who always brings suspiciously good mead to market. Romance in second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time around, you're older, wiser. You're not being pushed into an alliance. You're choosing someone to survive with, maybe even someone you like. Wild concept. Of course, there were rules. The church frowned on remarriage that happened too quickly. Like your spouse isn't cold yet. Quickly. And widows often had to negotiate with family over dowries and inheritance. Nothing says a romantic second chance like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short. Winters were long. No one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was part of it. Maybe not the swooning sonnet writing kind, but the quiet kind. Based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've made it this far, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a dramatic barn elopement. But before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of stars, bones, and whether or not your grandmother saw a fox this morning. Let's begin with astrology. Yes, before you kiss anyone, you might want to consult the local monk astrologer. Are your signs compatible? Is Venus in retrograde? Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon? If so, better to marry someone less cursed. Love is hard enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that might identify you as your soulmate's long-lost twin or their destined executioner. Superstitions were flexible like that, but the church had its own checklist. You couldn't marry your cousin or your second cousin or your fourth cousin twice removed unless you had special permission, which the wealthy often bought, because of loopholes. So before things got serious, you'd probably need to draw a family tree and then quietly erase parts of it. Social status also mattered deeply. A noble could not fall in love with a peasant without it being declared either a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song. And then there were the omens. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, bad sign. If you dropped bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, forget it. That's a cursed union. Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep to protect you from improper suitors or to sabotage your chances. Neither worked. Love in this world wasn't just personal. It was mystical. Everyone had an opinion. The stars, the saints, the weather, and that one woman in the woods who definitely wasn't a witch, except she probably was. But despite all the rules, signs, and whispered warnings, people still loved clumsily, bravely, often against advice. Because, medieval or not, the heart remains wonderfully disobedient. You've probably heard of Alexander the Great, maybe even Julius Caesar. But have you ever heard of the woman who allegedly chopped off the head of Cyrus the Great and dunked it in blood? Her name was Tamiris, and she didn't rule from a throne gilded in gold or within high-walled cities. No, her court was the open sky, her army was the wind, and her power came not from titles, but from pure, unshakable authority. She was queen of the Mazajt, a confederation of nomadic tribes who roamed the steppes of Central Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice. Tamiris didn't inherit her power from a pampered courtier system. She rose through grit, leadership, and possibly a healthy dose of don't mess with me energy. Her people were tough, accustomed to harsh winters, long migrations, and enemies on every side. But even among such people, she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand. Now, to be clear, much of what we know about Tamiris comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man not exactly known for his strict fact-checking. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then Tamiris wasn't just a queen. She was a storm in human form. At the heart of her story is this. A foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. He had already conquered Lydia and Babylon, and now his gaze turned east. The Mazajit were next on his list. But Cyrus didn't fully understand what kind of woman he was dealing with. Before the first arrow flew, before the first spear shattered, and before her son's death changed everything, Tamiris was already preparing for war, not because she wanted conquest, but because she refused submission. She wasn't just defending territory, she was defending a way of life. And as Cyrus would soon learn, there are some queens you just don't invade. Cyrus the Great had a reputation. He wasn't just any king, he was a conqueror's conqueror, the kind of man who could stroll into ancient cities, topple empires, and still get remembered fondly by historians. So when he looked towards the land of the Moschate, he didn't exactly expect resistance. After all, who could possibly say no to the man who had taken Babylon without even breaking a sweat? Cyrus sent a polite offer first because, of course, every good imperialist starts with a smile. He proposed a political marriage between himself and Tamiris. Now you might think that's romantic. But Tamiris saw right through it. She understood that this wasn't about love or even alliance. It was about control. If she married Cyrus, her kingdom would become just another province of the Persian Empire, and she would be a trophy queen. She declined firmly. Cyrus, unaccustomed to rejection, didn't take it well. If he couldn't charm her into submission, he would take her kingdom by force. He crossed the Araxes River, which separated his empire from the lands of the Mazajit, and established a foothold. But Tamiris was an idol. She gathered her warriors, consulted her chiefs, and prepared for what she knew was coming war. Then came the bait. Cyrus, under the guidance of his general Harpagus, laid a trap. He left a portion of his army behind, with a lavish camp overflowing with wine and food, luxuries that nomads rarely indulged in. Tamiris's son, Spargopizes, led a detachment to investigate. They raided the camp, took the supplies, and fatally drank the wine. The Persians returned at just the right moment. Drunk, disoriented, and unprepared, Spargopizes and his men were overwhelmed. He was captured alive. When Tamiris heard the news, her world cracked. This wasn't just a military loss. It was personal. Her son, her heir, was now a prisoner in Persian hands. She sent a message to Cyrus. "Give me back my son and leave. If you do not, I swear by the sun, the master of the Mazajit, I will give you your fill of blood." Cyrus didn't listen. Spargopizes, ashamed of his capture, killed himself in Persian custody. Tamiris had just lost her only son, and now she was out for blood. Grief is a powerful thing, but grief mixed with fury? That's the recipe for absolute devastation. When Tamiris learned her son Spargopizes had taken his own life in Persian captivity, something inside her snapped. This was no longer about borders, pride, or even independence. This was war soaked in vengeance. And Tamiris wasn't one to grieve quietly. She didn't retire to her tent in mourning robes or weep by the fire. No, she mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and swore an oath that would echo through history. She would face Cyrus in battle. She would defeat him, and then she would make sure he never forgot her name, even in death. According to Herodotus, Tamiris summoned her tribal council. Under her command, the massage team mobilized. Picture it. Hundreds of warriors on horseback, adorned in leather armor, wielding bows and spears, faces painted with fury. They didn't march like a Persian army. They moved like a storm, swift, chaotic, and with deadly precision. This time she set the trap. Cyrus, perhaps overconfident from his earlier deception, underestimated her resolve. But Tamiris knew his tactics now. She studied his movements, waited for the right moment, and then unleashed everything. The two armies clashed in what Herodotus describes as one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. There were no fancy formations or long speeches, just screaming horses, clashing blades, and a queen who fought alongside her warriors. No silk-robed empress here. Tamiris was in the thick of it, riding hard, cutting down enemies with merciless focus. And when the dust finally settled, Cyrus the Great was dead. Tamiris, ever theatrical in her justice, had his body searched. His head was severed, placed into a wineskin filled with blood, and presented as a final offering. According to Herodotus, she spoke to it. "You thirsted for blood. Now drink your fill." Whether or not every detail is true is almost beside the point, because what matters is that Tamiris won. She crushed the most powerful empire of her day, avenged her son, and made sure that her name would be remembered, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. And this was just the start of her legend. The battlefield was silent. The Persians were dead or fleeing, their legendary king lifeless in the dust. And Tamiris? She didn't celebrate like a conqueror. She didn't parade through Persepolis or carve her face into coins instead. She stood over Cyrus's body, her vengeance fulfilled, but her heart still broken. Victory, it turned out, didn't bring peace. The massager had won more than just a battle. They had turned the tide of the empire. The death of Cyrus the Great sent a shockwave, waves across the ancient world. In Babylon, Egypt, and the far corners of the Persian realm, rumors swirled. The unstoppable king had fallen, not at the hands of another great empire, but by a nomadic queen who had no throne, no palace, just fury, grit, and a cavalry of warriors who would ride into hell for her. And yet, Tamiris didn't exploit her victory for conquest. She returned to her people with the same pragmatism she ruled with. No war taxes, no imperial ambitions. She didn't try to seize the Persian throne. That wasn't her world. Her justice had been served. Her son had been avenged. The empire could continue without Cyrus, but now it would think twice before ever riding E again. It's worth noting just how rare this was. Most rulers, after winning a battle of that magnitude, would have grabbed power with both hands. But Tamiris seemed more concerned with preserving her people's freedom than expanding her reach. And yet this is where her story begins to fade. There are no records of her after the battle, no statues, no royal tomb, no massage monuments carved in stone. She rides into the fog of history, as elusive and untamed as the steppes themselves. Historians debate whether Herodotus exaggerated her tale. Some say Cyrus died elsewhere, that the wineskin of blood was poetic fiction. But even skeptics agree someone dealt Persia a heavy blow. And it wasn't a king. It wasn't a general. It was a queen, a mother, a woman whose love for her son fueled one of the most dramatic reckonings in ancient history. And her story, it didn't need to be written in stone. It was carried by the wind. Because when the wind howls across the steppe, some still say it whispers her name, Tamiris. To understand Meres, you have to understand the people she led. The Massagite weren't your typical ancient civilization. No marble temples, no hanging gardens, no scrolls of poetry. They were a nomadic warrior culture, living in the vast, untamed lands east of the Caspian Sea, lands too wild for Persian satraps or Babylonian scribes. Their world was one of movement, survival, and honor. Imagine sprawling plains without borders, herds of horses and cattle as currency, and warriors raised in the saddle. Children were taught to ride before they could walk straight. Archery wasn't a sport, it was second nature. Their bows were compact and deadly. Their armor, layers of leather and scale, flexible for riding, sturdy for war. They hunted, they raided, and they fought to protect their freedom. And unlike many patriarchal societies of the time, Musagite women could and did fight. That wasn't an exception. It was expected. Warrior women weren't legends. They were your neighbors. So when Tamiris picked up a sword and led her people into battle, no one raised an eyebrow. She wasn't pretending to be a man or defying norms. She was the norm, just sharper, smarter, and far more dangerous than most. Their society valued strength, but also justice. Crimes were punished harshly, but fairly. Property was communal in many ways. What mattered was loyalty to the tribe and the ability to defend it. Kings and queens ruled, yes, but through consensus, not tyranny. Leaders had to prove themselves through deeds, not bloodlines. And as for religion, they were sun worshippers. Tamiris, in her famous warning to Cyrus, swore by the sun, the master of the Massagete. The sun was life, light, and justice, the divine judge of all oaths. To break one's word was to spit in the face of the heavens. In short, Tamiris wasn't some anomaly. She was the ideal embodiment of her people. Fierce, principled, proud. She didn't rise to power in spite of being a woman. She rose because she was exactly the kind of leader the Massagete revered. While the Persians had bureaucracy, the Massagete had freedom. And in one brutal, history-defining clash, that freedom held its ground. Because when you come from a land where the wind never stops, and the sky is your only ceiling, submission is simply not an option. You know what's strange? Everything we know about Tamiris, her battle with Cyrus, her son's death, the wineskin full of blood, it all comes from one man, Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is often called the father of history, which sounds great until you realize he's also the father of hearsay, myth, and dramatic flair. The man loved a good story, and if that story involved divine omens, gory revenge, or queens shoving heads into blood, well, even better. So how much of Tamiris' tale is true? That depends on how much you trust a Greek writing decades after the events, who had probably never met a single message in his life. Herodotus relied on second-hand accounts, travelers' tales, and whatever rumors were circling the Persian Empire. To him, history wasn't just a record, it was a performance. Still, here's the thing. He chose to tell her story. In a world brimming with male warlords, tyrants, and kings, Herodotus went out of his way to spotlight a steppe queen who brought down one of the greatest rulers in history. That's not nothing. But let's zoom out. Why did this tale spread so widely? Simple. It had everything. A noblewoman, a tragic son, a cunning enemy, a battle to the death, a gory finale worthy of any Greek tragedy. If you were living in Athens or Thebes and heard this tale from a traveling bard, you remembered Tamiris forever. Not because she wore a crown, but because she dared to defy a superpower in one. And over time, her story morphed. Medieval chronicles painted her as a savage Amazon. Renaissance artists depicted her drenched in blood, holding Cyrus's head like a trophy. She was exotic, fearsome, iconic. Yet through all the retellings, something real clings to her legend. Maybe not the exact dialogue, maybe not the wineskin, but the bones of the story, the queen, the sun, the war, the victory feel too specific, too human to be pure invention. In the end, Herodotus didn't just preserve Tamiris, he mythologized her. And while that may blur the lines between fact and fiction, it also ensured that her name would live far longer than Cyrus's imperial edicts, because history forgets generals, but it remembers vengeance. For a queen with no surviving monuments, Tamiris has haunted the imagination of empires for over 2,000 years. Renaissance painters adored her. She was a dramatic muse, perfect for the bloody climax of a canvas. In 1622, Rubens painted her calmly, holding a severed head, while courtiers looked on in awe. In another, she stands regal and composed, while Cyrus's decapitated head is ceremonially dunked into a golden vessel brimming with blood. Tasteful. Maybe not. Memorable. Absolutely. To European artists, Tamiris wasn't just a historical figure. She was symbolically incarnate. A woman who punished pride, a savage noble, a cautionary tale, a feminist icon. Depending on who was holding the brush, she could represent the righteous fury of a mother, the barbarism of the East, or the wisdom of a ruler who refused to be bought. Writers loved her too. In the 18th and 19th centuries, she appeared in plays, novels, and philosophical tracts. Enlightenment thinkers debated, whether she was proof that women could govern wisely or a reminder of what happens when emotions rule leadership. Either way, she stayed in print, but oddly enough, her own people left no records. The Massagite faded from history, absorbed or erased by later nomadic cultures. No carved inscriptions, no burial mounds with gold plaques saying Tamiris was here. Her memory survived entirely through outsiders' eyes, and yet she kept reappearing in Soviet-era Central Asia. Tamiris was reclaimed as a symbol of resistance against imperialism. Statues of her were erected in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Modern scholars reevaluated her not as a bloodthirsty barbarian, but as a legitimate head of state, a woman who ruled, led armies, and negotiated from a position of strength. She has appeared in everything from documentaries to video games. In one moment, she's a playable leader in a strategy game. In the next, she's being analyzed in academic journals on gender and power. That's the range. And here's the strange part. We still don't even know what she looked like. No coins, no bust, no carvings. But we know what she stood for. Strength, vengeance, autonomy, legacy. In a world that forgets queens who behave, Tamiris is remembered because she did not. She didn't ask to be part of history's art gallery. She kicked the door down and posed for the bloodiest portrait ever painted. Tamiris wasn't the first woman to lead warriors into battle, and she certainly wasn't the last. But history tends to treat women like her as exceptions, isolated flashes of power in a man's world. The truth? Tamiris was part of a long, often overlooked lineage of women who ruled through the sword. Let's rewind a bit. Before Tamiris, there was Shemuramat, the Assyrian queen who may have inspired the mythical Semiramis, builder of cities, slayer of rebels. Around the same era, the Scythians, cultural cousins of the Massagetae, had female warriors buried with weapons, their skeletons showing clear signs of battle injuries. These weren't ceremonial roles. These women fought, bled, and died on horseback. And after Tamiris came Boudica, the Celtic queen who led a fiery revolt against the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, is often compared to her. Like Tamiris, Boudica's war was sparked by personal loss. Her daughters were assaulted, her land seized. Her response? She burned Roman settlements to ash. The parallels are uncanny: grief, vengeance, and an empire too arrogant to see what was coming. There's also Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, who in the 3rd century CE defied Rome itself and carved out her own mini-empire in the east. She minted coins with her face. She declared independence. She made the emperor come to her. What binds all these women together, Tamiris included, isn't just power, it's audacity. They led in eras that pretended leadership belonged to men. They wielded authority not as caretakers or stand-ins, but as strategists, generals, and rulers. And while many male leaders were praised for their conquests, these women were often labeled dangerous, unnatural, savage. Why? Because they won. Tamiris wasn't an outlier. She was part of a global, centuries-long pattern of women who rose in times of crisis and made kings bleed. Her story, preserved by Greek pens and modern imagination, reminds us that female leadership wasn't rare. It was just rarely recorded. So when you picture ancient warfare, don't just see helmets and beards. See a queen on horseback, bow in hand, blood in her eyes, and understand Tamiris wasn't alone. She was just one of the few they couldn't erase. Tamiris never built a palace. She didn't leave behind golden inscriptions or dynastic walls. There's no great tomb, no preserved armor, no marble bust in a museum. And yet she endures. In many ways, her legacy is a paradox. Her entire story hinges on a handful of paragraphs from Herodotus, biased, embellished, possibly fictional. But those words planted a seed that refused to die. For over 2 millennia, her name has resurfaced again and again in times when the world needed to remember that power doesn't always wear a crown or a beard. She's been reimagined through so many lenses. To Renaissance Europe, she was the noble savage, a warning to tyrants. To modern Central Asia, she became a folk hero, a symbol of resistance and national pride, especially in countries still reckoning with colonial and imperial pasts. Statues of her rise from plazas in Kazakhstan. Children learn her name in school books. Politicians quote her when invoking strength and independence. But beyond symbolism and myth, there's something undeniably human about her story. It's about a mother who lost her son. It's about a leader forced to choose between surrender and survival. It's about a person who, when cornered by one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen, chose to fight and win. In a world that often erases the names of warrior women, Tamiris persists like a blade buried just beneath the surface, always ready to be unearthed by a new generation, hungry for stories of untamed defiance. She reminds us that history isn't just kings and empires. It's also mothers and queens, grief and revenge, dirt and blood. It's the silent moments after battle when a woman stands alone in a field littered with corpses, knowing she has changed the course of the world but will never be fully believed. And that might be her greatest legacy, the refusal to be forgotten. No statues, no problem. Her name still rides on the wind of the steppes. Her story still makes emperors look mortal, and her legend still whispers the warning, "Come for me, and you'll drink your fill of blood." So the next time you hear of a great king's downfall, remember, sometimes the final blow comes not from a rival empire, but from a queen on horseback, lost to history, but never truly gone. Imagine a life where your walls are made of felt, your roof is stitched from hide, and your front door opens to the horizon. There are no cities, no farmland, no stone monuments to pass on to the future, just the rhythm of hooves, the whisper of grass, and the ever-changing sky. For ancient nomadic cultures, permanence was a myth and mobility was strength, from the Eurasian steppes to the Arabian deserts. Ancient nomads shaped entire civilizations without leaving a single marble temple. These weren't ruthless wanderers. They were strategic movers, guided by the seasons, the grazing patterns of their herds, and an intimate understanding of terrain. Their homes were yurts, tents, or wheeled wagons, foldable fortresses designed for life on the move. Cattle, sheep, goats, and most of all, horses, were the pillars of nomadic life. A person's wealth was counted in livestock, not land. Horses were more than tools. They were companions, weapons, and status symbols. To ride well was to survive. To ride best was to rule. But being mobile didn't mean being disorganized. Nomadic societies had complex social structures. Power usually flowed through clans and tribes, with leadership often based on merit and influence rather than strict heredity. A chief or khan might rise through tactical brilliance, oratory skill, or sheer charisma. Loyalty was personal, earned in campfire councils and on wind-scoured battlefields. And far from being isolated from the world, nomads were its connective tissue. They moved silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and slaves from Europe. Nomadic caravans and traders were the original transcontinental couriers. Long before empires caught on, and when trade broke down, they raided swift, strategic, and terrifyingly efficient. Their history wasn't written in stone. It was sung, recited, and remembered. Elders passed down legends and laws through oral tradition. A tribe's entire legal system, history, and identity could be carried in the mind of a single bard or elder. Stories weren't entertainment. They were instruction, governance, and identity. In the eyes of empires, nomads were unpredictable, alien, and dangerous. But to themselves, they were guardians of freedom, masters of adaptation, and heirs to the wind. They left a few ruins behind, but they reshaped the world every time they rode. Long before the Mongols thundered across Eurasia, the Scythians ruled the windswept steppe. Between the 9th and 2nd centuries BCE, these nomadic warriors dominated the land stretching from the Black Sea to the edges of Central Asia. To the Greeks, they were fearsome horsemen and exotic barbarians. To themselves, they were a people of freedom, vengeance, and pride. Scythian society was built around mobility and violence. Their horse culture was unmatched. Boys learned to ride before they could walk properly. Their weapons were practical and deadly. Short composite bows, ideal for shooting while galloping at full speed, curved swords, battle axes, and iron-tipped spears. The Scythian warrior wasn't just a man either. Archaeological finds confirm what Herodotus hinted at. Women fought too. Some graves reveal female skeletons buried with weapons, showing battle wounds that only came from real combat. They didn't build cities, but their kurgans, burial mounds, have preserved their legacy. Beneath these mounds, archaeologists have found gold, intricate tattoos on preserved skin, embroidered garments, and elaborate weaponry. Their art style, full of swirling animals and predatory symbolism, reflects a life bound to nature and the hunt. But the Scythians weren't just wild raiders. They were diplomats, mercenaries, and traders. Especially with Greek colonies along the Black Sea, they sold furs, slaves, and grain, and in return imported wine, pottery, and luxury goods. Greek writers both admired and feared them. Herodotus wrote of their strange customs, like drinking the blood of enemies or using scalps as napkins, but he also praised their justice and loyalty to kin. Their religion was primal and animistic. They worshipped gods of war, fire, and fertility. Some rituals involved cannabis smoke, others horse sacrifice. Their worldview was cyclical and tied to the land, not in terms of ownership, but sacred movement. Eventually, they faded. Pressured by other nomadic groups like the Sarmatians and boxed in by growing empires, the Scythians dissolved into history. But they set the standard for the steppe warrior archetype, a mobile, deadly, fiercely independent fighters with no master and no fixed home. They didn't write books. But when you see a mounted archer silhouetted against the steppe, that shadow is Scythian. They were the storm before the empire. While the Scythians ruled the grasslands, the Bedouins carved their legacy into sand. Originating in the vast deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouin were not merely wanderers. They were engineers of survival, mastering some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Unlike the mounted thunder of steppe nomads, the Bedouin life was quieter, more deliberate. It was built around the rhythms of the desert, drought and rainfall, grazing routes, and the movements of stars. Their home was the black goat hair tent or Beit el Shah, portable, breathable, and easy to pack. Life moved with the camels, known as the ships of the desert. Camels were transport, food, clothing, and currency all at once. The Bedouin were famed for their tribal structure. Everything revolved around the clan. Loyalty to kin came before all else. Honor or sheriff wasn't just a word, it was the social glue. A single insult could start a blood feud, but generosity to guest Karam was just as sacred. The stranger could expect food, water, and protection for 3 days, no questions asked. Their warfare was rooted in the raid or gazu, fast, strategic attacks designed to capture goods and livestock without unnecessary bloodshed. The battle wasn't about mass slaughter. It was about survival, prestige, and honor. A successful raid elevated a man's status. A failed one could stain a tribe's reputation for generations. But Bedouin life wasn't all conflict and sandstorms. It was rich in oral tradition. Poets were warriors of words. Their verses preserved history, shamed enemies, and praised heroes. Poetry was passed from memory to memory, often performed in song-like cadence around a fire. Some poems became tribal lore, others became legacy. Trade caravans also passed through Bedouin lands. These tribesmen served as guides, protectors, and sometimes smugglers, moving goods like incense, spices, and silk from southern Arabia to the Levant and beyond. They knew every oasis, every star path. Their knowledge was legendary and expensive. Though many Bedouins later integrated into cities and empires, they maintained a fierce sense of identity even today. The black tent and tribal codes remained symbols of Bedouin pride. They weren't just survivors of the desert, they were its soul. No nomadic people have ever reshaped the world quite like the Mongols in the 13th century. These steppe riders erupted out of the plains of Mongolia and carved out the largest contiguous land empire in history. But their roots were no different than the other nomadic cultures they followed, mobile, clan-based, and fiercely adaptive. Life on the Mongolian steppe was brutal and demanding. The Mongols lived in jirs, circular felt tents that could be assembled in under an hour and packed onto a cart the next morning. Their herds, horses, yaks, goats sustained them, and their children were raised in the saddle. Riding was a skill learned before literacy. In fact, most Mongols couldn't read, but they didn't need to. Their knowledge was encoded in songs, proverbs, and memory. What made the Mongols different was how they weaponized mobility. Under Genghis Khan, tribal divisions were shattered and reorganized into a new merit-based system. Loyalty to tribe was replaced by loyalty to the Khan, and with that the world changed. Mongol warfare was a ballet of speed and deception. Their horse archers could fire accurately at full gallop, fake retreats to lure enemies, and travel over 100 miles a day. But they weren't just raiders, they were strategists. They used scouts, spies, signal flags, and psychological warfare with terrifying precision. Once they began conquering cities, they adapted quickly. Siege engineers from China and Persia joined their ranks. The Mongols learned how to build catapults, flaming arrows, and battering rams, and use them with chilling efficiency. But here's the twist. They weren't just destroyers. The Mongol Empire connected the world in ways never seen before. They revived and protected the Silk Road, ensuring safe passage from China to Europe. Goods, ideas, and even diseases like the Black Death traveled their vast network. They introduced paper currency, passport systems, and religious tolerance across their realm. A Muslim merchant, a Christian priest, and a Buddhist monk could all travel safely under Mongol rule, as long as they didn't rebel. And yet they remained nomads at heart. Even as they governed empires, Mongol rulers still returned to their tents, their herds, and the open steppe. They conquered cities but never truly belonged to them, because no matter how high they climbed, they always rode with the wind at their backs. To the sedentary empires, nomads were either useful or dangerous, and sometimes both at the same time. But to nomads, the line between trade and raid was negotiable. One day, they'd escort your caravans across the desert. Next, they'd plunder your border towns. It all depended on the mood, the season, and how well you paid. Trade was vital to nomadic life. Most nomads couldn't grow grain or make pottery. They needed tools, textiles, spices, and luxury goods. In exchange, they offered livestock, furs, leather, salt, and exotic items like falcons or rare horses. Some traded directly with empires. Others operated as middlemen between distant regions, forming crucial links along the Silk Road, Incense Route, and other transcontinental paths. But these weren't simple merchant caravans. They were armed convoys, ready to defend themselves or attack, depending on the situation. A tribal leader might negotiate with a border governor one week, then raid his storehouses the next. Empires called this treachery. Nomads called it options. The Scythians, for example, traded grain and gold to Greek cities along the Black Sea, but if a city tried to cheat them, they burned it. The Bedouins protected incense and spice caravans across Arabia. Unless someone failed to pay protection fees, then the camels changed direction. The Mongols under Genghis Khan initially tried peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian Empire, but when their merchants were executed, they responded by annihilating entire cities. To the nomadic mind, trade was personal and political. It wasn't just business, it was a reflection of respect. If a sedentary kingdom treated the nomads as equals, commerce thrived. If they disrespected them, the punishment was swift and usually on horseback. This tension gave rise to a strange relationship. Border economies, towns and cities on the edge of nomadic zones often became hybrid spaces. Half military outpost, half market. Governors bribed chieftains. Tribes traded news, horses, and intelligence. Sometimes marriages were arranged to seal fragile peace. This dance between trade and raid wasn't a flaw in nomadic life. It was a feature. It allowed them to negotiate power without occupying territory, to influence empires without building them, and to remain fluid in a world that worshipped walls. They didn't need to conquer cities. They just needed cities to keep watching the horizon in a world without libraries, scrolls, or printing presses. How do you preserve your history for nomadic cultures? The answer was simple and incredibly powerful. You remember it. Oral tradition wasn't just a storytelling tool for ancient nomads. It was their library, courtroom, constitution, and mythos all rolled into one. From the Scythian grasslands to the Mongol plains and the Bedouin deserts, memory was sacred and the tongue was sharper than the sword. Elders were more than old men and women. They were archives in human form. They knew lineages stretching back a dozen generations, war stories that shaped tribal identity, and proverbs that guided decisions in peace and battle alike. These weren't campfire tales told for amusement. These were lessons, warnings, and laws. Among the Bedouins, poetry was king. A well-crafted verse could shame an enemy, honor a fallen warrior, or settle a dispute. Poets, or shair, were advisors to tribal leaders, remembered more clearly than many chiefs. Their words could ignite war or stop it cold, and their memory flawless. Entire epics were passed down word for word, generation after generation. The Mongols were no different. The great work known as The Secret History of the Mongols was first preserved orally, only written down later. It tells not just the rise of Genghis Khan, but the cultural values of loyalty, fate, revenge, and ambition that defined their world. It isn't a dry historical record. It's a living saga, originally recited by heart to teach and unify. Even the Scythians, who left almost no written records, maintained detailed oral accounts of their migrations, battles, and alliances when Greek writers like Herodotus described their tales. They were capturing echoes of a far older spoken tradition. History passed through campfires, not chiseled in stone. Oral tradition had its risks. Memories faded, stories evolved. But it also had one massive advantage. It lived. It was adaptable, flexible, and deeply human. It allowed nomadic societies to retain identity even after migrations, defeats, or cultural absorption. Empires may have fallen, and their archives turned to dust. But nomadic stories survived, not because they were written down, but because they were woven into breath. And as long as someone remembered, nothing was truly lost. In many ancient civilizations, women were confined to the background, silent, veiled, or confined behind palace walls. But in nomadic societies, the story was often very different. On the move, everyone worked, and that meant women held power too. From the Scythians to the Mongols, archaeological and historical evidence shows that nomadic women were not just mothers and wives. They were riders, warriors, shamans, diplomats, and clan leaders. Life on the move didn't allow for idle hands. Every member of the community, regardless of gender, had to contribute to survival, warfare, and governance. Take the Scythians, for example. Burial sites across the Eurasian steppe have revealed women buried with swords, arrows, and armor, their bones showing injuries from combat. These weren't symbolic burials. These women fought. Greek historians were so intrigued and terrified that they crafted entire myths about Amazons. Fierce warrior women supposedly descended from these nomadic tribes in Mongol society. Women managed the encampments while the men were away raiding or conquering. But even at the highest levels of power, women left their mark. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law often ruled territories, led armies, and conducted diplomacy. One of the most powerful women in Mongol history, Surdig Tani Beki, was a strategist and kingmaker who raised emperors and brokered alliances. Among the Bedouins, women had fewer public leadership roles, but still wielded influence through poetry, family alliances, and the sacred traditions of hospitality. A woman's tent was her domain. Her ability to manage resources, uphold honor, and raise future warriors made her a central figure in tribal life. In some tribes, women could initiate divorce, control property, and even own camels, the ultimate symbol of wealth and survival. Religion also gave nomadic women spiritual authority. In various Turkic and Siberian steppe cultures, female shamans played crucial roles as healers, spirit guides, and keepers of ancestral wisdom. They weren't fringe mystics. They were respected pillars of the community. In short, mobility created necessity, and necessity gave rise to equality, at least more than what was seen in most empires of the time. The unpredictable nature of nomadic life demanded flexibility if a man fell in battle. A woman stepped up without ceremony, without asking permission. In these windswept societies, a woman could be the hand that rocked the cradle and the hand that drew the bow. For nomadic peoples, spirituality was not tied to temples or sacred buildings. It was woven into the land, the sky, and the journey itself. When your life is in constant motion, your gods ride with you. Nomadic belief systems were typically animistic and nature-based, rooted in the cycles of the seasons, the behavior of animals, and the rhythms of survival. The wind wasn't just weather, it was a messenger. Mountains were guardians. Rivers carried spirits. Fire was sacred. Life was a dialogue with the unseen among the Scythians described by Herodotus. Worship centered on a pantheon of gods tied to the natural world, to Beti, the goddess of the hearth, likely equivalent to Hestia, and Papeos, the sky god. Rituals often involved horse sacrifice, cannabis smoke, and sacred oaths sworn under open skies. Their spiritual world was visceral, earthy, and direct. No priests in robes, just warriors and shamans calling to the heavens. The Bedouins, before the rise of Islam, practiced a form of polytheism centered around local deities and tribal idols. But above all, they revere the unseen, the mysterious forces of fate and nature. Jinn or spirits were believed to dwell in rocks, windstorms, and lonely places. Poets and seers were thought to be inspired, sometimes even possessed by these entities. Hospitality wasn't just a custom, it was a spiritual obligation in Mongol culture. The spiritual world was structured around Tengrism, the worship of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Tengri wasn't a god you prayed to in a temple. He was the sky itself, ever present, watching and judging. Genghis Khan claimed his right to rule came from Tengri. Mongols also revered earth spirits, ancestral ghosts, and the sacred fire in the center of every tent. Shamanism played a vital role. Shamans were healers, spirit guides, and political advisors. The beauty of nomadic spirituality was its adaptability. As nomads came into contact with Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others, they often blended these beliefs with their own. Mongol emperors patronized multiple religions at once. A Bedouin could follow Islamic law while still clinging to older, desert-rooted customs. Whereas cities built temples to contain the divine, nomads carried the sacred with them. Their gods moved. Their rituals adapted, and their beliefs flowed like the rivers they crossed. Because to a nomad, faith didn't need four walls, just sky above, earth below, and memory in between. They didn't leave behind pyramids or cathedrals. You won't find their capitals on modern maps. And yet the legacy of ancient nomadic cultures is written all over history in the flow of trade, the scars of conquest, and even the languages we speak. Nomads were not historical footnotes. They were architects of disruption, reshaping entire continents through movement. The Silk Road, that wasn't just a route for silk and spices. It was a highway built by hoofs, maintained by the diplomacy, muscle, and local knowledge of nomadic tribes. Without them, East and West might never have met. Empires feared them, and for good reason. The Scythians, Xiongnu, Turks, and Mongols all challenged the myth of urban superiority. Their victories exposed a fundamental truth. Mobility can outthink monuments. Where empires moved slowly, nomads adapted. When cities relied on walls, nomads relied on speed. But their influence wasn't only military. They acted as cultural bridges, carrying music, recipes, stories, and even religion from one world to another. Mongol rule brought Chinese printing technology to Persia. Arab Bedouin tradition shaped the early Islamic world, from language and law to poetry and honor codes. Turkic nomads laid the groundwork for the Ottoman Empire. The paths they rode became arteries of civilization. Even after their empires faded, their spirit endured. You can see it in modern horsemanship, in oral storytelling cultures, and in the values of kinship, resilience, and independence that still echo across the steppe, desert, and tundra. In many ways, they also serve as a warning. They remind us that no structure is permanent, not even the grandest empire. They prove that the wind could erase borders, and that power didn't need to be carved in stone to be real. Today, many nomadic peoples still exist, though fewer in number and often under pressure from modern borders, climate change, and urbanization. Yet their descendants carry traditions older than most nations, hospitality to strangers, reverence for animals, and stories that ride through generations like horses through fog. So when you study history, don't just look at the walls, the temples, the thrones. Look between them. That's where the nomads lived, and that's where history moved. In the mid-1800s, America was a country divided not just by politics, but by terrain. The East bustled with cities, factories, and ports. The West was a wild expanse of mountains, deserts and gold fields, and between them stretched over 1,300 miles of unforgiving wilderness. To journey from New York to California meant weeks on a ship around Cape Horn, or months in a wagon, dodging disease, bandits, and dust. But the dream was there. A railroad that would tie the country together, steel rail by steel rail, a direct line from coast to coast, unthinkable to some, inevitable to others. Visionaries believed it could unite the Republic, speed up communication, move armies, open new markets, and settle the untamed frontier. To build it, however, would require more than ambition. It would take money, labor, land, and political power. That last part came with the Civil War. In 1862, while the nation was tearing itself apart, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The law authorized two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to start building from opposite ends of the country. The Union Pacific would head west from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would go east from Sacramento, California. They would meet in the middle. To fuel the construction, the government offered massive land grants. For every mile of track laid, each company received up to 640 acres of public land and generous loans. The race was on not just to unite the country, but to claim land, money, and history itself. On paper, it was a marvel of infrastructure. In reality, it was about to become one of the most grueling construction efforts in American history. Workers would blast through mountains, bridge vast plains, and brave bitter winters and scorching deserts. Thousands of immigrants and laborers will be brought in to do the work. The rewards will be monumental, but so would the human cost. And for the indigenous nations living on the land where the tracks would cut through like a scar, this was not progress. It was a warning. In 1862, the idea still sounded like a gamble, but within 7 years, two lines would meet in the Utah desert and change America forever. While the Union Pacific had the flat plains of Nebraska ahead of them, the Central Pacific faced a far more brutal challenge from the very start, the Sierra Nevada mountains. These weren't gentle hills. They were towering granite peaks prone to avalanches, snow drifts, and backbreaking terrain. And this was before dynamite was even invented. Construction began in Sacramento in 1863, but the rail wall stood just 80 miles east. The Sierras were a formidable barricade, and every mile of track laid felt like a war against nature itself. To conquer this obstacle, the Central Pacific needed labor, a lot of it. At first, they hired mostly Irish immigrants and white laborers, but many quit, unable or unwilling to face the grueling conditions. That's when the company turned to a new workforce, Chinese immigrants. By 1865, over 10,000 Chinese laborers were building the railroad, more than 80% of the Central Pacific's entire workforce. They were paid less than white workers, often lived in more dangerous conditions, and faced deep racism. But they proved indispensable, showing incredible skill, endurance, and discipline. Their work was heroic and horrific. They carved tunnels through solid rock using only hand tools and black powder. The most infamous Tunnel Number 6 took nearly 2 years to complete. In winter, snow drifts reached 40 feet. Workers lived in camps buried beneath snow, connected by vertical shafts like chimneys. Dozens died in avalanches, explosions, and rock slides. And yet the line advanced. To speed progress, Chinese crews suspended themselves in baskets over cliffs, chipping away at stone inch by inch. When they couldn't go around a mountain, they went through it. When they couldn't level terrain, they built wooden trestles that soared above ravines. It was some of the most dangerous and underappreciated labor in American history. Few records exist of individual Chinese workers. No statues were built for them at the time, but without their hands, the transcontinental dream would have died in the Sierras. By 1867, the Central Pacific finally emerged from the mountains. What lay ahead was desert. Harsh, dry, and deadly, but flat. The worst was behind them. The race to the meeting point was truly on. While the Central Pacific was battling granite and snow in the west, the Union Pacific had its own gauntlet to run. Starting from Omaha, Nebraska, the company laid track westward through the Great Plains, a land that seemed endless, flat, and deceptively simple. But the challenge wasn't geography, it was people, politics, and power. The Union Pacific hired largely Irish immigrants, former Union soldiers and freedmen. Many were veterans looking for steady pay after the Civil War. Crews could lay 2, sometimes even 3 miles of track in a single day. The wide open plains allowed speed, but they also exposed the workers to raids, starvation, and environmental extremes. This was indigenous land, the Pawnee Cheyenne. Arapaho and Lakota Sioux had hunted, lived, and died on these plains for generations, and to them the railroad was not progressing. It was an invasion. The track cut directly through tribal hunting grounds. The smoke-belching engines frightened buffalo herds. Telegraph poles and surveyors disrupted sacred spaces. Tribes saw what was coming: settlers, soldiers, fences, and displacement. Resistance was inevitable. The Lakota Sioux, under leaders like Red Cloud, fought back fiercely. They raided camps, attacked surveying teams, and tore up rails. In response, the U.S. government built forts along the route and stationed troops to guard the track. Railroad construction became a militarized operation, with track layers working under the protection of armed guards. It was a low-grade war fought with rifles and treaties that never lasted. For the indigenous nations, the railroad represented a death sentence for their way of life, and they were right. Still, the Union Pacific pushed forward. Financially backed by massive federal loans and led by men like Thomas Durant, the company laid track at breakneck speed. Crews lived in temporary towns, dubbed Hell on Wheels, which sprang up overnight and disappeared just as fast. Gambling, whiskey, and violence followed the workers like a dust storm. By 1867, Union Pacific had reached Cheyenne and was headed into Wyoming. The mountains loomed in the distance, but the real mountain they were climbing was political. How do you unite a nation when you're laying rails over the bones of another? For the Union Pacific, the answer was simple: lay the track. Don't look back. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is often told with golden spikes and great men in top hats. But the real story, it's soaked in sweat, muscle, and pain, much of it provided by men whose names were never recorded, whose graves were never marked, and whose stories were buried beneath the tracks they built. In the Central Pacific, it was the Chinese laborers who did the impossible, nearly 15,000 of them, most hailing from Guangdong province. Endured freezing temperatures, deadly explosions, and racial hostility while tunneling through the Sierra Nevada. They earned less than white workers, received no recognition, and were often housed in separate, inferior camps. But they persisted quietly, skillfully, and relentlessly, despite being called weak and unfit by early skeptics. The Chinese crews soon proved to be the most reliable workforce on a railroad. They blasted rock, laid rail, built trestles, and cooked their own food, often staying healthier than their counterparts. Yet when the last spike was driven at Promontory Point, none of them were invited to the celebration photo. Meanwhile, in the Union Pacific, Irish immigrants made up a large portion of the workforce. Many had survived famine and war, only to face new dangers on the plains. They fought off raids, laid track at incredible speed, and drank themselves to sleep in rickety tents. Their lives were hard, but their labor was essential. Former enslaved African Americans also worked the rails, some hired as freedmen seeking better lives. Their contributions, like those of the Chinese and Irish, went largely uncredited. Laborers of color were exploited but indispensable. This was a multinational workforce, building a nation with bare hands and broken backs. And then there were the cooks, blacksmiths, teamsters, and supply haulers, each playing a role in keeping the great machine of progress moving forward. None of them were executives, but without them, there'd be no golden spike. In the grand American myth, we tend to spotlight the visionaries and tycoons. But railroads weren't laid by dreams alone. They were laid by calloused hands, underpaid men and marginalized workers, people who bent history with no guarantee they'd be remembered. They didn't build the railroad for glory. They built it to survive. By the late 1860s, the two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were no longer just building tracks. They were locked in a frenzied competition, each racing toward an invisible meeting point somewhere in the Utah Territory. But this wasn't a gentleman's agreement. It was a war for land, money, and prestige. Why the urgency? Because of the way the government subsidies worked. For every mile of track completed, each company received federal land grants and hefty loans. The more track you built, the more profit you claimed. So naturally, both sides tried to outbuild the other, even laying parallel tracks in opposite directions, knowing full well that only one set would be used. It became absurd. Crews worked at breakneck speed. The Central Pacific, fresh off their victory over the Sierra Nevada, now blasted through the Nevada and Utah deserts. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific crossed rivers and high plains, skirting the edge of the Rocky Mountains. They even began laying track through areas they knew the government would eventually declare wasteful, just to secure funding. Work intensified to near manic levels. The Central Pacific's Chinese crews set a world record in April 1869, 10 miles of track laid in a single day, a feat unmatched even today. They accomplished this using synchronized teams, rotating shifts, and a rhythm honed through years of labor. Union Pacific crews, not to be outdone, pushed hard from the east despite ongoing labor strikes, supply issues, and mismanagement from their financier, Thomas Durant, who was more interested in stock manipulation than railroad engineering. The two tracks finally neared each other at Promontory Summit in present-day Utah. Surveyors marked the site. Arrangements were made for a formal ceremony. Locomotives from both companies, Central Pacific's Jupiter and Union Pacific's NOAA 19, were brought face-to-face, cowcatcher to cowcatcher. Executives prepared speeches. A special golden spike was commissioned. Telegraph wires were hooked up to transmit the final hammer blows in real time across the country. But behind the celebration was the lingering reality. The race had been brutal, often reckless, and entirely driven by profit. The rails were now joined, but the scars they left behind on land, labor, and lives would remain for generations. Progress had a finish line, and both companies were willing to trample over anything to cross it. On May 10, 1869, the windswept plains of Promontory Summit, Utah became the center of the American universe. A crowd of workers, officials, journalists, and railroad executives gathered to witness the momentous event, the joining of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Two gleaming locomotives stood nose to nose on the finished track, the Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's number 119. Between them lay a final rail, and at its center a golden spike engraved with the words, "May God continue the unity of our country," as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world. Telegraph lines had been connected to the ceremonial hammer. Each blow would send an electric signal across the country as Leland Stanford, representing the Central Pacific, raised the sledgehammer. Americans across the nation leaned in to listen. With each swing, the telegraph clicked. Done. Church bells rang, cannons fired. Cities erupted in celebration. From New York to San Francisco, it was as if a national artery had been stitched together in real time. The East and West were no longer months apart. They were 7 days apart by rail. It was a stunning engineering achievement. The United States was now bound coast to coast by steel and steam. The symbolic significance couldn't be overstated. A young post-Civil War nation had proven it could connect its fractured parts and march into a modern industrial era. But not everyone was part of the celebration. None of the Chinese workers who had laid most of the Central Pacific's track were invited to the photo. They had been excluded from the ceremony entirely, despite their role in accomplishing the impossible. The Irish laborers, freedmen, native guides, and other marginalized workers were also absent from the frame. In their place stood bearded men in frock coats, holding hammers and cigars. So while the country celebrated unity, the reality was more complex. The railroad did connect east to west, but also sharpened divisions between races, classes, and cultures. It united markets, but at the cost of many human lives. The photo that day captured the official story of the railroad. But the real story, that was buried beneath the track. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad didn't just shrink geography, it exploded the American economy. Almost overnight, the United States was no longer a bicoastal nation awkwardly bridged by wilderness. It was now a single economic organism, pulsing with movement, commerce, and opportunity. Goods that once took months to transport by wagon or ship could now move from coast to coast in under a week. Agricultural products from the Midwest, wheat, corn, cattle, could be shipped westward to booming mining towns or eastward to the industrial cities. Manufactured goods flowed in the opposite direction. Rail cars replaced oxen. Steam replaced sail. What had once been an uncertain frontier was now a profitable supply chain. Towns sprouted like weeds along the railroad towns that grew up almost overnight. Some became cities. Others disappeared as quickly as they came, especially if the rail line shifted. But each one was a node in a growing network, connected by a steady rhythm of pistons, whistles, and smoke. The railroad also helped fuel industrial growth. Ironworks, coal mines, timber mills all surged with demand. The need for rails, locomotives, and infrastructure created jobs across the nation. Steel barons and railroad tycoons got rich, bankers lined their pockets, and small-time entrepreneurs rode the wave, opening hotels, restaurants, and general stores along the line. Mail moved faster. News traveled across time zones in days instead of weeks. For the first time, the government could project real presence across the full continent, deploying troops, resources, and political influence wherever the rails reached. And let's not forget the human factor. Millions of people moved Immigrants from Europe who once landed in New York now saw a direct path to land and labor in California, Oregon, and the Western Territories. Homesteaders, prospectors, ranchers, and outlaws all rode the same steel RD toward destiny. Of course, this boom wasn't evenly shared. Wealth flowed upward. Native lands were devoured. Laborers remained poor. But there's no denying it. The railroad transformed the U.S. from a regional republic into a continental power. The engine wasn't just moving people. It was moving money, power, and the future. And once it started, it wasn't going to stop. Beneath the polished steel and triumphant headlines of the Transcontinental Railroad lay a darker, more tragic legacy: the destruction of indigenous lands, lives, and cultures. The railroad didn't just connect east and west. It sliced through native homelands, carving out routes through territories held by the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, Ute, and many others. What had once been open plains and sacred ground was now divided by rails, telegraph poles, and fencing. With each spike driven, native sovereignty was eroded. The impact was immediate and brutal. Buffalo herds, central to plains, tribes, economies, diets, and spirituality were slaughtered en masse to clear the way for trains and settlers. In some cases, passengers were encouraged to shoot buffalo for sport from moving trains. These herds, once numbering in the tens of millions, dwindled to near extinction in just a few decades. The railroad brought more than tracks. It brought settlers, soldiers, and surveyors. Towns popped up where there had been none. Homesteaders, empowered by the federal government, staked claims on tribal lands. What treaties hadn't been taken, the railroad now absorbed. And with settlers came enforcement, military garrisons. Sent to protect the tracks and suppress any resistance, conflicts erupted. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribes fought back in what became a series of bloody wars, some labeled uprisings, others outright massacres. From the Red Cloud's War to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the railroads were both the battleground and the prize. Eventually, resistance was crushed. Indigenous nations were confined to reservations, often hundreds of miles from their ancestral lands. The psychological toll was immense. Sacred sites were desecrated. Hunting patterns were broken. Nomadic cultures built around seasonal migration and vast open space were forced into fixed locations under constant surveillance, and all of it was justified in the name of progress. The Transcontinental Railroad was hailed as a marvel of American ingenuity, but it came at the cost of 1,000 nations' dreams. It wasn't just the iron that cut through the land. It was the erasure of a way of life replaced by timetables and timbers. History books often praise the railroad for uniting a nation, but for native peoples, it tore theirs apart. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it wasn't just the end of a railroad. It was the beginning of a new American identity. Faster, hungrier, and increasingly shaped by steel and steam, the Transcontinental Railroad shrank the country. What had once taken 6 months by wagon or ship now took 7 days by rail. It changed how people moved, how goods were exchanged, and how the very idea of distance was understood. Suddenly, the concept of a coast-to-coast nation wasn't a dream. It was a daily reality. The railroad fueled the rise of time zones. Created to coordinate cross-country travel and commerce, it reorganized agriculture, allowing farmers to send produce across state lines. It powered the Second Industrial Revolution, enabling raw materials to flow efficiently into urban factories. The rhythm of the country began to match the clatter of trains. Culturally, the railroad reinforced a sense of manifest destiny, the belief that America was meant to span from Atlantic to Pacific. It made expansion feel not just possible, but inevitable. With rails stretching across deserts, mountains, and plains, there was no longer a wild frontier. Everything felt reachable. Everything felt claimable. But the railroad also set the template for corporate power in America. Massive wealth accumulated at the top. Men like Leland Stanford, Thomas Durant, and Collis Huntington didn't just get rich, they shaped policy. Bought politicians and built empires. Corruption scandals like the Credit Mobilier affair exposed how deeply railroad interests were embedded in government. For laborers, the train tracks marked both opportunity and exploitation. For indigenous peoples, it marked the end of a world. For the environment, it brought radical change. Forests cleared, rivers bridged, buffalo nearly exterminated. Yet for all its costs, the railroad undeniably stitched the fabric of a modern America. It connected immigrants to opportunity, businesses to markets, and governments to distant territories. It transformed an experimental republic into a fully integrated nation. The iron rails didn't just carry passengers, they carried ambition, destruction, hope, and hubris. The railroad was both a triumph and a tragedy. And once those twin locomotives touched cowcatchers in the Utah desert, the country was never the same again. The nation was transformed not by war or election, but by iron and fire. She was born Sophie Friedrich August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg on May 2, 1729, in a quiet corner of the Holy Roman Empire. Her family was noble, yes, but only just. They were minor German aristocrats, well-connected but not powerful, living in modest comfort, not in grandeur. Her father was a Prussian officer. Her mother was ambitious and sharp-tongued, dreaming of elevating the family status through clever marriage alliances. Sophie, even as a child, sensed this hunger for social climbing, sensed it, and in time would wield it like a weapon. She wasn't born to rule. No one in Germany whispered her name with destiny. Yet she was bright, intellectually curious, unusually poised, and obsessed with learning. She absorbed languages easily, devoured books, and watched court behavior with hawk-like focus. Her world was small, but her mind was already wandering far beyond the cold halls of Zerbst. When she was 14, the unexpected happened. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, who had no children of her own, had chosen a successor, her nephew, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, another German-born noble. But Peter needed a bride, and Elizabeth wanted one who could be easily molded. Sophie was selected. Overnight, her world shifted. Russia was not just another country. It was an empire vast and strange, and it would soon become her home. The journey was long and cold. Sophie arrived in Russia as a foreigner, with little Russian, no Orthodox faith, and only a name that tied her to her former life. But she didn't hesitate. She converted to Orthodoxy, taking the name Catherine Alexeyevna. She studied Russian day and night until she could speak it better than Peter. She adapted, reshaped herself, erased any trace of resistance. Her mother called her too serious. Courtiers called her too quiet. But Catherine was studying everyone, especially her future husband. She saw in Peter a boy trapped in a man's body, childish and awkward, more enamored with his military dolls than with diplomacy or love. And in that cold realization, Catherine made her first quiet vow. If Peter could inherit a throne, she could steal one. She had arrived as a pawn in someone else's game, but already the pieces were moving and Catherine intended to become queen. The royal wedding was everything it needed to be. Grand, symbolic, politically useful. But for Catherine, it was also the beginning of a long, icy winter. Her husband, Peter, was no Prince Charming, immature, awkward, and emotionally stunted. Peter showed little interest in his bride. He spent more time marching toy soldiers across tabletops than engaging in the affairs of court or the heart. At times, he seemed more like a child playing emperor than a man destined to rule one of the world's largest empires. Catherine, however, played her part with quiet precision. She smiled at the right moments. She dressed with elegance. She observed everything, especially what not to become. She quickly realized that if she was to survive in a Russian court, she had to rely on her wits, not her marriage. And so she began to build a life of the mind. She read compulsively, hiding books beneath her pillows and staying up through the night. History, philosophy, the writings of Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire became her secret teachers. She wrote letters, kept journals, and began to shape a private vision of what a ruler could be. Someone who used power not for cruelty or indulgence, but for progress, justice, and reform. In a palace that whispered with intrigue, Catherine was quietly becoming dangerous. Yet danger worked both ways. The court was treacherous. Spies lingered in hallways. Alliances shifted overnight. Even Catherine's health faltered. Rumors swirled that Peter resented her so deeply. He withheld medicine during a near-fatal illness. She recovered, but she never forgot. And so Catherine began cultivating her own allies, a few key nobles, military men, even her personal physician. She learned which words to say, which to withhold, and which to whisper behind closed doors. And when her marriage turned cold, she turned to others for affection. Lovers entered her life discreetly for now, and with them came influence, protection, and sometimes love. But love was not her goal. Power was. Peter was still the heir, but Catherine was no longer content to be his shadow. She had tasted the politics of survival, the thrill of reading forbidden text, and the sweet clarity of ambition. She would not just be empress by title, she would be empress by will. When Empress Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter III ascended the throne. Catherine, now in her early 30s, had waited over a decade in the shadows, reading, learning, preparing. But the man she married remained as erratic and unpopular as ever. In just a few short months, Peter managed to alienate the Russian Orthodox Church, insult the nobility, and withdraw troops from a victorious war against Prussia, his homeland's ally but Russia's enemy. His loyalty to Frederick the Great disgusted the military. His mocking of Russian traditions infuriated the court and Catherine. She watched it all with silent precision. She had already begun nurturing a quiet network of loyalists, men like Grigory Orlov, a dashing military officer, and her lover who had close ties to the Imperial Guard. Orlov wasn't just a romantic partner. He was her key to power. Behind palace walls, Catherine whispered her plans. She made promises. She secured oaths. She had no legal claim to the throne, but she had something far more potent, the confidence of those who held swords. Then came the moment. On the morning of June 28, 1762, with Peter distracted and unaware, Catherine made her move. She rode to the Ismailovsky regiment barracks, stood before the soldiers, and declared herself sovereign of Russia. They pledged loyalty on the spot. One by one, the guards, the nobles, and even the clergy followed. She rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, calm and commanding. The people didn't rise against her. They welcomed her. Peter fled. Days later, he was forced to abdicate, and soon after he was dead, murdered under suspicious circumstances, likely by Catherine's allies. She never admitted to ordering it. She never denied benefiting from it. When asked about his death, she simply said he was no longer needed. It had been a nearly bloodless coup. No mass uprisings, no civil war, just a perfectly executed pivot of power from one ruler to another. Catherine had done the unthinkable. A foreign-born woman had seized the Russian throne without heritage, without majority support, and without fear. Her rule was now official. But now came the harder part, proving she deserved it. She had claimed the crown. Now she would have to earn it. Catherine understood something few rulers of her time did, that power wasn't just about military control or royal blood. It was about image. And so once the crown was hers, she didn't rest. She transformed from a coup-born ruler. She recast herself as a reformer, a student of enlightenment, a sovereign with vision. She styled herself as a philosopher on the throne, exchanging letters with Voltaire, Diderot, and other great thinkers of Europe. To them, she wasn't just a monarch. She was proof that ideas could shape empires. She invited philosophers to court, sent money to scholars, publicly praised liberty, education, and reason, all while ruling with unmatched authority. But ideas didn't always fit neatly into Russian reality. Russia was still a deeply feudal society. The nobility held land and peasants. Serfdom chained millions in poverty. Catherine wanted to reform it. She dreamed of modernizing the legal system, improving schools, and cleaning the bureaucracy of corruption. In 1767, she convened a commission to draft a new legal code, one that would be fair, rational, and humane. She personally wrote the Nakaz or Instruction, a bold Enlightenment-inspired document that criticized torture, advocated for education, and emphasized equality before the law. European thinkers hailed it as visionary. But at home, the commission failed. The nobles weren't interested in giving up their privileges. The clergy pushed back against secular ideas. And Catherine, ever the realist, stepped back. She would not spark civil war in the name of idealism. She shelved many reforms, but she never abandoned the image of reform. Still, some changes did take root. She expanded education, especially for girls. She founded the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, Russia's first state-funded school for women. She poured resources into the arts, opening theaters, libraries, and museums. Under her reign, St. Petersburg became a center of culture and elegance. She was building a Russian enlightenment, not by force, but by inspiration. Yet her enlightenment was a delicate dance. She had to keep the nobles loyal, the peasants quiet, and the philosophers impressed. She walked a tightrope between progress and preservation, between ideals and power. Catherine spoke the language of liberty, but she ruled with the discipline of a monarch, and behind every public ideal was a very calculated strategy. For all her intellect and discipline, Catherine could never escape one thing: people's obsession with her personal life. In the glittering halls of the Russian court, where whispers traveled faster than truth, the empress's lovers became legends. Her first great affair after the coup had been with Grigory Orlov, the soldier who helped bring her to power. Brave, loyal, and handsome, Orlov was more than a romantic partner. He was her co-conspirator. Together, they had reshaped the future of the Russian Empire. But as the years passed, their bond began to fade. Orlov's behavior turned erratic, and Catherine, ever rational, began to look elsewhere. What followed was a long series of liaisons. Each one is carefully chosen. These are not reckless flings. Catherine's lovers were often men of talent, intelligence, or military value. They were part of her political ecosystem. Some were gifted administrators, others were generals, and one, Grigory Potemkin, would become the most significant. Potemkin was no ordinary court favorite. He was brilliant, passionate, and ambitious. Their love burned intensely, and though it didn't last romantically forever, their political partnership endured for life. Potemkin helped Catherine secure Crimea, expand Russia's borders, and shape foreign policy. They may have even secretly married, though no proof was ever found. But even after they drifted romantically, they wrote to each other constantly. Warm, witty, and often intimate letters that revealed mutual admiration. Still, the court, then the continent gossiped. Foreign ambassadors reported breathlessly on her long list of lovers. Pamphlets in Europe painted her as immoral, debauched, even dangerous. One grotesque rumor, completely false, claims she died attempting to be intimate with a horse. It was pure slander, weaponized misogyny meant to punish a woman for ruling with strength and sensuality. Catherine never responded to these attacks directly. She didn't need to. Her rule spoke louder than any whisper. She had taken and held the Russian throne. She expanded its territory, reformed its institutions, and governed with unmatched efficiency. Yes, she loved fiercely, but never foolishly. Her affairs may have shocked the old world, but to Catherine, love was just another arena of politics, a place where loyalty was earned, passion was useful, and hearts could be as strategic as armies. Catherine spoke often of liberty, of justice, of enlightenment. But behind the silks and salons, behind the witty letters to Voltaire and the progressive speeches, was a ruler who understood the necessity of power and the price of keeping it. In 1773, just over a decade into her reign, Russia erupted with a man named Yemelyan Pugachev. A Cossack and former soldier claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's long-dead husband. He called her a usurper, promised land to the peasants, freedom to the serfs. He lit a flame that spread quickly through the countryside, where suffering and resentment had long been simmering. It became the Pugachev Rebellion, the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Catherine, shaken, responded without mercy. Troops were dispatched, villages burned. Rebels were captured, tortured, and hanged. Pugachev himself was paraded through Moscow in a cage before being executed, and with his death, Catherine sent a clear message. Challenge the throne, and you will suffer. It was a turning point. The empress, who had once championed the rights of the people, now ruled with far less idealism. She had seen what chaos looked like, and it terrified her. The rebellion had exposed the deep fractures of her empire, the poverty, the inequality, the desperation. But instead of addressing those wounds through reform, she tightened her grip. Serfdom expanded under her rule. Noble privileges were strengthened. The vast rural poor fell deeper into bondage to preserve peace. Catherine sided with the aristocracy because they held the key to her survival. And yet, the contradiction haunted her reign in Europe. She was still the enlightened monarch, the modernizer, the patron of the arts and sciences. But at home, she had become something sterner, more imperial, less idealistic. The woman who once dreamed of rewriting Russia's laws now issued decrees that reinforced the status quo. But perhaps that was her genius. Catherine had learned what many idealists never do, that to keep power in a turbulent world, you sometimes have to betray the very ideas that brought you there. She wore philosophy like a crown, but underneath it was iron. If Catherine ruled Russia with vision, she expanded it with precision. Unlike many monarchs who dreamed only of securing borders, she dreamed of growing them. For Russia would not just be a landmass, it would be an empire of influence, culture, and raw geopolitical power. She turned her gaze first to the Black Sea and the weakening Ottoman Empire. Controlling the Crimea meant warm water ports, new trade routes, and strategic dominance. The wars were long and costly, but Catherine's army, guided in part by her trusted advisor Grigory Potemkin, was relentless. By 1783, Crimea was annexed. Russia now had direct access to the Black Sea, and with it a seat at the table of maritime powers. Next, she turned Poland, fractured by internal strife and weakened by centuries of political infighting, became her next focus. Catherine positioned herself as a protector of Polish stability while secretly working to divide and conquer. In 3 stages, the partitions of Poland, she joined with Austria and Prussia to carve up the country. By the final partition in 1795, Poland as an independent state had vanished. A once proud kingdom was now divided, and much of its eastern territory belonged to Catherine. It was brutal diplomacy, cold, calculated, effective. Under her reign, Russia's borders expanded by more than 200,000 square miles. Millions of new subjects were added. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Tatars, Jews. The Russian Empire had never been larger nor more diverse, but expansion came with cost. The new territories were difficult to govern. Some resisted Russian control, others demanded autonomy. The empire grew heavier and harder to hold. Catherine responded with reforms, reorganizing provinces, setting up new schools, and attempting to standardize administration. It was a bureaucratic race against unrest. Yet through it all, Catherine remained composed. She presented her conquests not as imperial aggression, but as civilization's advance. She wrote to European leaders as if she were spreading Enlightenment ideals, not swallowing nations. To her allies, she was a stateswoman. To her enemies, an imperial predator. But to history, she was something more rare. A ruler who expanded an empire not through reckless war, but through cunning strategy and diplomatic elegance. With every annexation, her Russia grew not just in size, but in ambition. As Catherine aged, The fire in her mind never dimmed, but her body began to slow. She remained fiercely active in government, reading reports, drafting reforms, and attending court functions well into her 60s. But the world around her was changing, and fast across Europe, revolution was in the air. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, sending shockwaves through every royal court. Kings were beheaded. Crowds demanded liberty and equality. For an empress who once embraced Enlightenment ideals, the uprising was deeply unsettling. Catherine, once a friend to philosophers, now saw their words as dangerous sparks. She banned French revolutionary texts. She tightened censorship. Her court, once open to ideas, became suspicious and guarded. Her enlightenment, it seemed, had an expiration date. She also grew more isolated. The love of her life, Potemkin, passed away in 1791. Their relationship had long shifted from romantic to political, but his death struck her deeply. She continued to rely on younger favorites, men who were charming and loyal, but rarely matched the strategic brilliance of her earlier companions. And then there was her son, Paul. Catherine distrusted him. She saw in Paul none of her intelligence, none of her stability. He was emotional, impulsive, and drawn to autocratic ideals that clashed with her more balanced style. Privately, she considered bypassing him altogether, grooming her grandson Alexander as the next Tsar. It was a bold plan, one she never had time to complete. In November of 1796, Catherine suffered a massive stroke. She never regained consciousness. She died days later, alone in her chambers, with unfinished reforms on her desk and unspoken thoughts in her journals. When Paul took the throne, his first act was to undo many of his mother's policies. He buried her in Peter's mausoleum next to the husband she had overthrown and who may have died by her command. In death, they were united in stone, though never in life. The court mourned her, the country paused, and Europe watched the passing of one of its most fascinating monarchs. Catherine the Great had reigned for 34 years. She left behind a larger, more powerful Russia and a legacy that still sparks debate centuries later. But her final chapter was written in silence. Catherine the Great was never supposed to rule. She wasn't Russian by birth. She wasn't born into a throne. And yet, through intelligence, political mastery, and ruthless determination, she became one of the longest reigning monarchs in Russian history. Her legacy is complex, full of contradictions that history continues to unravel. She spoke the language of enlightenment. She wrote about justice, reason, and reform. She engaged with the greatest minds of her age and tried to bring their ideals into one of the most autocratic empires in the world. But when those ideals threatened her power, she suppressed them. She dreamed of freeing the serfs, but expanded serfdom. She spoke of equality, but ruled with absolute authority. And yet her impact is undeniable. She modernized Russia's administration, making it more efficient, more centralized, more capable. She brought schools, hospitals, and the arts to cities that had once known little more than military parades and church rituals. Under her leadership, Russia became not just bigger, but stronger, wealthier, and more respected on the world stage. She ruled in a man's world and beat men at their own game. Her court was filled with powerful advisors and lovers. But make no mistake, Catherine was always the one in control. Every relationship, every policy, every letter she wrote was part of a broader vision. She turned St. Petersburg into a beacon of European culture. She expanded the empire's borders beyond imagination. And she left behind libraries, statues, and institutions that carried her name long after her death. But perhaps her greatest legacy is not in territory or legislation, but in possibility. Catherine proved that a woman could lead an empire, that charisma, intellect, and sheer force of will could elevate a minor princess into a world-shaping sovereign. She shattered expectations, not with rebellion, but with refinement. Not with noise, but with calculation. To some, she remains a symbol of tyranny, to others, a goddess of reason. But to history, she is something greater than myth, something real. A flawed, brilliant, relentless human being who ruled for over 3 decades and left her fingerprints on an entire civilization. Catherine the Great didn't just reign. She rewrote the script for what a ruler, any ruler, could be. Long before it was a city, El Dorado was a man, a king, they said, covered from head to toe in fine gold dust. He stood upon a raft floating in the middle of a sacred lake, surrounded by priests and nobles. As the sun rose, he cast jewels, emeralds, and golden offerings into the water, tributes to the gods. It was a ceremony, a legend, a whisper in the wind. The indigenous Muisca people of what is now Colombia called him El Hombre Dorado, the Golden Man. But when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, they misunderstood. They heard El Dorado and didn't think of a ritual or a man. They imagined a place, a golden kingdom hidden in the mountains, untouched by war, glittering with treasure. The transformation was quick in the European imagination. El Dorado morphed from a man into a city, then a kingdom, then an entire empire. The name didn't just mean gold. It meant paradise, salvation, a place where all desires could be fulfilled. And for the Spaniards, starving, desperate, thousands of miles from home, it was irresistible. The jungles of South America became alive with a rumor, somewhere deep in the green unknown. A city of gold waited. The native people spoke carefully, often trying to appease or mislead their aggressive guests. They mentioned far-off lands, strange rivers, and shimmering objects. The conquistadors, hungry for wealth and honor, took every word as a clue. El Dorado wasn't just a myth, it became a fever. In campfires and letters back home, the tale grew larger. Soldiers who hadn't even left Spain heard about it. Poets romanticized it. Monarchs funded expeditions for it. It no longer mattered if it existed. What mattered was the belief that it could, and belief in the age of conquest was all you needed. This golden illusion would drive some men to greatness and others to madness. It would become one of the most powerful legends in the history of exploration, a promise of riches just out of reach. Always deeper in the jungle, always just beyond the next ridge, El Dorado was no longer a story. It was a compass that pointed to nowhere, and still they followed it. In 1541, a brutal expedition set out from Quito, led by Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the infamous Francisco Pizarro, who had conquered the Inca Empire. Gonzalo had heard the rumors of cinnamon forests, of lands rich with gold, and of a golden city called El Dorado, waiting just beyond the Andes. He was determined to find it, no matter the cost. He brought with him over 300 Spanish soldiers, hundreds of native porters, a few dozen horses, and a dream made of gold and desperation. The jungle, however, was not a dream. It was a living, breathing nightmare. Rain poured for days without stopping. Rivers swelled and swallowed their supplies. Insects devoured skin. Men collapsed from exhaustion, hunger, and disease. As the weeks dragged into months, the expedition began to disintegrate. Food vanished. Morale crumbled. Many of the indigenous porters died or fled. The Spanish, wearing heavy armor and carrying weapons now useless against the jungle, became weak and paranoid. Gonzalo Pizarro, desperate, ordered a smaller party to push ahead in search of food and a way forward. That group was led by Francisco de Orellana, a lesser-known nobleman, who would soon make history by accident. Orellana's party floated down a river, following its winding current deeper into unknown territory. Days turned into weeks, and Orellana realized he couldn't return upstream to rejoin Pizarro. There was only one path left forward with a handful of men and a makeshift brigantine. Orellana continued down what would one day be called the Amazon River. He passed through vast, seemingly endless forests and encountered indigenous civilizations that appeared far more advanced than expected. He later claimed to have seen grand cities, well-organized societies, and even tribes of warrior women, stories that would inflame the El Dorado legend for centuries. Eventually, Orellana reached the Atlantic Ocean. He became the first European to navigate the entire length of the Amazon, but he had found no gold, no El Dorado, only a myth that now stretched across a continent. Back in the Andes, Gonzalo Pizarro's forces had nearly all died. The survivors crawled back to Quito, broken and starving, but the damage had already been done. The jungle had taken its first real blood for El Dorado, and the myth was just getting started. By the mid-1500s, the Spanish obsession with El Dorado had shifted from the vast unknown of the jungle to a single haunting place, Lake Guatavita. Nestled in the green highlands of what is now central Colombia, this almost perfectly circular crater lake shimmered with eerie beauty. But it wasn't the view that drew conquistadors. It was the legend the Muisca people who lived nearby had long performed sacred rituals there. One ritual in particular had gripped European imaginations. A chieftain naked and dusted in gold, sailing to the center of the lake on a raft, tossing emeralds, gold, and precious offerings into the water as gifts to the gods. To the Spanish, it wasn't religion, it was a vault, and they were determined to open it in 1536. Conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada was the first to arrive. His men fished a few golden trinkets from the lake's edge, stirring just enough hope to keep the obsession alive. Over the next few decades, multiple attempts were made to extract the supposed treasure resting at the lake's bottom. In one of the most infamous efforts in 1580, a wealthy entrepreneur named Antonio de Sepulveda tried to drain the entire lake. He and his crew of indigenous laborers dug a massive gash into the mountainside, forming a channel to bleed the water away. As the level dropped, mud and debris surfaced, along with some pieces of gold, but the sides collapsed before the lake could be fully drained. The excavation killed many workers, and while a few golden artifacts were found, the mythical hoard of treasure remained hidden beneath layers of silt and legend. Still, the effort had a strange consequence. The lake itself became sacred to the myth of El Dorado. It wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It became the beating heart of the story, a place where gold had been offered for centuries, where secrets lay buried beneath the water's surface, and where hope refused to die. Even centuries later, Lake Guatavita would draw treasure hunters armed with sonar, scuba gear, and dynamite. But the lake remained stubborn. It kept its secrets close, and like the myth it fueled, it promised everything and delivered only echoes. By the late 16th century, El Dorado fever had crossed the Atlantic. No longer was it only a Spanish pursuit. Now the English, ambitious, rising and eager to challenge Spain's dominance, set their sights on the Golden City, and no one was more enchanted by the legend than Sir Walter Raleigh, a poet-soldier. And favorite of Queen Elizabeth II, Raleigh was bold, intelligent, and full of theatrical charm. But he was also fiercely ambitious, desperate to carve a legacy that would rival the great conquistadors. El Dorado, he believed, was not just a myth. It was his destiny. In 1595, Raleigh sailed to Guyana, the dense, unmapped region near the Orinoco River in present-day Venezuela. He had read Spanish reports, heard tales from captured natives, and convinced himself that the city of gold lay somewhere in the rain-drenched interior. His journey was grueling, thick jungles, choking heat, and uncooperative terrain. But he returned home with a spectacular story. He claimed to have found a civilization on the verge of discovery, a land rich with gold, ruled by a mighty emperor just beyond reach. His published account, the discovery of the large, rich, and beautiful empire of Guyana, was filled with vague maps and suggestive detail. There was no proof, but Raleigh's words sparkled with enough imagination to captivate England. Queen Elizabeth was intrigued. The public was enthralled. Raleigh became a legend. But the years passed. Elizabeth died. Raleigh lost his favor and his freedom, imprisoned in the Tower of London under King James I. Yet El Dorado still burned in his mind. In 1617, after years of confinement, he was granted one last chance, an expedition to Guyana to finally prove his claim. This time, it all fell apart. His men attacked a Spanish outpost, violating the fragile peace between England and Spain. Worse, Raleigh's beloved son was killed in a skirmish, defeated. Grieving and empty-handed, Raleigh returned to England. King James was furious. Raleigh was executed in 1618, beheaded in public, his dreams undone by the very myth he once made shine. He had chased a city that may never have existed, and in doing so, he became its most tragic explorer. As the centuries turned, El Dorado refused to die with every failed expedition. The myth only grew more potent, like a mirage that shimmered brighter the more it was chased. The jungle, vast and uncharted, became both canvas and executioner. Countless men ventured into its emerald depths, convinced that gold awaited just beyond the next ridge, the next river, the next breathless day. They came from everywhere. Portuguese fortune seekers, German adventurers, Dutch traders, Jesuit missionaries. Each carried stories, weapons, and dreams. Few returned. fewer still return saying, the Amazon rainforest, which spans millions of square kilometers, is one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Thick canopies blocked out the sun. Rivers changed direction without warning. Poisonous insects and deadly snakes blended into the foliage. Starvation claimed some. Disease claimed others. Those who managed to push deeper faced even greater threats. Indigenous tribes, fiercely protective of their lands, whose resistance was swift, coordinated, and often fatal. Time and again the same pattern emerged. A promising lead, a well-funded expedition, weeks of struggle, and then silence. Many were never seen again. Still, belief persisted. The myth had evolved. El Dorado was no longer a single city. It became a floating dream. To some it was hidden in the Andes, to others deep in the jungle's belly. Some imagined it in caves, others in lakes. It changed with every explorer's hope, and that's what made it dangerous. The jungle didn't need traps. It didn't need armies. It only needed time. Men wandered deeper and deeper, guided by hope and misdirection, until exhaustion broke them. Some went mad, others turned on each other. The line between explorer and victim blurred until it was erased entirely. Even when nothing was found, the survivors still spoke of signs, glimpses of golden idols, distant lights, strange voices echoing at night. Their minds, half starved and half hallucinating, became compasses spinning wildly in all directions. El Dorado had become a psychological labyrinth, one that promised paradise but demanded everything in return. The jungle didn't guard a city of gold. It guarded a story, and in that story, hope itself became a trap. For centuries, the myth of El Dorado was dismissed as fantasy, an illusion spun from greed, misunderstanding, and European arrogance. But in recent decades, something remarkable has emerged. Evidence that maybe, just maybe, El Dorado wasn't entirely a lie. Not a city of golden walls, no. Not streets paved in treasure, but signs of vast, advanced civilizations that once thrived in the very regions conquistadors called empty. Deep within the Amazon, archaeologists and scientists have uncovered remnants of lost cities, agricultural systems, and vast RD. Networks now buried beneath layers of jungle in Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru. Satellite imagery and ground surveys have revealed the outlines of geometric mounds, motor towns, and intricate irrigation canals. These weren't small, tribal encampments. They were organized societies, some likely home to tens of thousands of people. And then there's the soil. In scattered parts of the Amazon, researchers found terra preta, dark earth, enriched with charcoal, bones, and compost. It's not natural, it was engineered. Created by ancient Amazonians to make poor soil fertile. It suggests a long-term, sustainable civilization that understood its environment far better than once believed. Could it be that when early explorers spoke of great cities in the jungle, they were seeing the last flickers of a dying world, a civilization ravaged by European disease before it could be fully understood? Some believe so, even Francisco de Orellana, whose Amazon journey was long considered exaggerated, is now being reassessed. His claims of bustling cities and powerful tribes were dismissed for centuries, but new findings suggest he may have been telling the truth, just a version of it Europe wasn't ready to believe. So perhaps El Dorado was never one golden city, but the reflection of many real ones, a patchwork of thriving cultures that dazzle the eyes of outsiders only to vanish under jungle and time. The legend, then, was not built from nothing. It was built from fragments, misunderstood and reshaped by conquest. The goal may have been symbolic, the grandeur exaggerated, but the roots of the story were always real. El Dorado may not have been a place on a map, but it may have been a memory. As the myth of El Dorado spread through Europe, it didn't just live in songs or whispered tales. It was etched into maps. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, mapmakers, cartographers working from stories rather than science, began to fill the blank spaces of South America with invention. The unknown was terrifying, but it was also a blank canvas, and nothing filled that canvas better than gold. Across old parchment maps, the word El Dorado appears in bold script, pinned to lakes, rivers, and mountains that never existed. Sometimes the city was shown as nestled near Lake Guatavita. Other times it floated deep in the Amazon or hidden behind the Orinoco. Some maps included entire golden empires, complete with drawn buildings, sun temples, and fantastical creatures guarding the way. These maps weren't drawn to deceive. Not exactly. They were drawn to sell. Each one was a siren song to monarchs, merchants, and mercenaries. They sparked funding for expeditions. They justified claims over foreign lands. They offered explorers something just real enough to chase. The absence of proof was the point. The less certain the location, the more imagination it allowed. And so the myth grew, not just in stories, but in geography. Some of these maps found their way into royal courts. Others were published in books, passed from hand to hand by those dreaming of wealth and wonder. They were copied, plagiarized, embellished, and every new version added more detail, more certainty, more allure. These false geographies had real consequences. Expeditions were launched based on them. Lives were lost pursuing the curves of rivers that didn't exist. Entire regions were colonized based on legends scribbled by men who had never stepped foot outside Europe. But the most fascinating part? Some of these maps continue to circulate after El Dorado had been discredited. Why? Because humans don't let go of hope easily. A map is more than a tool. It's a promise. And these promises glittered. Even today, those antique maps are sought after collector's items. Not because they're accurate, but because they captured a moment when belief was stronger than evidence. El Dorado never needed to be real. It just needed to be drawn. Centuries have passed. The jungle has swallowed up the bones, the rusted swords, and the silent footprints of those who chased El Dorado. And still, the myth survives. It lives in books, films, and museum exhibits. In the animated stories we show our children and the documentaries we stream late into the night. It's Indiana Jones. And the road to El Dorado. It's a symbol now, more than a city, more than a man. It's an idea. Even into the 19th and 20th centuries, explorers still return to South America, armed now with compasses, rifles, and scientific curiosity. Alexander von Humboldt, one of the most respected scientists of his time, ventured through South America in the early 1800s. Though skeptical, even he was drawn to the stories. He searched not for gold, but for truth, and found the jungle still whispered of hidden civilizations. Later came Percy Fawcett, the British explorer whose obsession with a lost Amazonian city he called Zed mirrored the old dreams of El Dorado. In 1925, he vanished into the jungle with his son, never to return. Some say he died at the hands of a tribe. Others believe he found something and chose to stay hidden. And even in the 21st century, the search hasn't ended. Armed with satellite imagery, drones, and LiDAR technology, archaeologists are still uncovering evidence of ancient, complex Amazonian civilizations. No golden city has been found, but new ruins, earthworks, and settlement grids suggest that the heart of the jungle once beat with life far richer than ever imagined. And yet, El Dorado still gleams. Not on the ground, but in the mind. Because we never really needed proof. We needed the pursuit. The idea that somewhere out there is more. That one last secret remains untold. That if we go far enough, try hard enough, risk enough, we'll find the thing that changes everything. El Dorado is no longer a physical place. It's a metaphor for ambition, for obsession, for human hunger, for what lies just beyond the horizon. We chase it in careers, in relationships, in dreams, and sometimes in jungles. It doesn't matter if it's real. What matters is that we keep walking toward it. In the end, El Dorado was never found. No gilded city, no palace walls shimmering in the sun, no thrones carved from emerald. The jungle never opened its hands. And yet, the legacy of El Dorado outlasted the kingdoms that searched for it. Because what the explorers didn't realize, what they couldn't realize, was that the real treasure was never gold. It was what the journey revealed about themselves, about civilization, and about the stories we cling to. They found rivers no map had ever shown. They encountered people with knowledge of the forest that rivaled any European academy. They recorded languages, flora, and customs never before seen by the Western world. Some of them, like Francisco de Orellana, unknowingly made history not by discovering El Dorado, but by opening a path into the heart of the largest rainforest on Earth. Others lost everything: their wealth, their sanity, their lives. And yet they too are part of the legend. Their names echo through time, not for what they found, but for what they were willing to risk. El Dorado endures because it speaks to something buried deep inside us. The belief that there is always more to discover, more to become, more just beyond the horizon. We see it in every venture, every impossible dream. The entrepreneur chasing the perfect idea, the artist searching for the perfect work, the traveler seeking the untouched corner of the world. They are all in their own way, following a golden city that may not exist, but still shapes everything they do. The myth is not a failure, it's a mirror. It reflects our ambition, our curiosity, and yes, our greed. It shows how far we'll go for something beautiful, something meaningful, something that whispers to us in the quiet, saying just a little further. El Dorado is not a lost city. It's a question, and each generation answers it in their own way. So the next time you hear a story too good to be true, ask yourself, is it a lie or is it a dream worth chasing? Because sometimes the real El Dorado is the journey itself. The origins of the Olympic Games weren't about records or trophies. They were about reverence. It was the year 776 BC, deep in the cradle of ancient Greece. Across the mountains and valleys, people began to gather, not to fight, not to trade, but to worship. They came to a sacred place known as Olympia, nestled in the lush landscape of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. There was no city here, only a religious sanctuary, shaded by olive trees and protected by the watchful gaze of gods carved in marble. The purpose? To honor Zeus, the king of the gods, through ritual, sacrifice, and the physical excellence of mortal men. The Olympic Games were born not in a stadium, but at an altar, an ancient mound of ash built from generations of burnt offerings. Before a single race was run, before a discus flew through the air, sacrifices were made. Oxen were led to the altar. Incense was burned. Hymns were sung. The first Olympics were, at their core, an act of devotion. Only Greek men were allowed to compete, only free citizens. They came representing their polis city-states like Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Sparta. Each athlete wasn't just racing for himself. He was racing for his homeland, carrying its pride on his back like a cloak. There were no stands, no announcers, no global audience, but the air buzzed with something sacred. Olympia became a crossroads where language, politics, and rivalry paused, if only for a few days, and Greeks remembered that they were one people under the gods. And so, from all corners of the Hellenic world, they came barefoot and bronzed, some walking for weeks just to be part of the moment. Competing wasn't just allowed, it was holy. It was a way of stepping closer to the divine, of testing the human form as the gods intended it to be. Strong, focused, and unashamed. There was no gold, no silver, only honor. No empire had demanded this gathering. No king decreed it. The games rose from a deeper place, something woven into the soul of Greek identity. Here, in the shadow of temples, under the eyes of Zeus, the Olympic Games took their first breath. Not as a sport, but as a sacred ritual in a land often divided by rivalries and endless war. It was remarkable that every 4 years the Greeks found a reason to stop fighting. That reason was Zeus. Before each Olympic Games began, heralds were sent out from Elis, the region that governed Olympia, to announce the Echekia, the sacred truce. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a solemn, binding agreement for 1 month, sometimes 3. All warfare across the Greek world was to cease. No armies could march, no soldiers could draw swords. Even hostile borders were temporarily opened, allowing athletes, priests, and spectators to travel freely. The truce didn't mean peace between city-states. It meant respect for something higher than politics, the gods. In theory, it allowed athletes from anywhere in the Greek world, whether allies or bitter enemies, to journey safely to Olympia. In practice, it was a miracle of diplomacy. City-states that had clashed on the battlefield one season could stand side by side on the track the next. Even Sparta, with all its martial pride and defiance, observed the truce for much of its early history. To violate the truce was to invite divine wrath. those who dared face sanctions not just from other city-states, but from the gods themselves. Zeus was not just a protector of the games. He was their witness. At Olympia, a massive bronze statue of Zeus stood with thunderbolt in hand, a silent reminder that the rules of the gods were not to be broken. But the truce wasn't only about safety, it was about unity. Greece was not a nation. It was a patchwork of fiercely independent police, often at war with each other. Yet through the sacred truce, they could gather together in a single place, for a single purpose, bound by shared reverence. It was more than just political necessity. It was symbolic. The truce taught that even in a world ruled by conflict, there could be moments of order, respect, and ritual. For a brief time, Greek identity rose above rivalry, and as the olive wreaths were prepared and athletes stepped into the arena, it was under the quiet power of peace, not one enforced by soldiers, but one commanded by the gods. At Olympia, there were no uniforms, no tunics, no armor. The athletes of ancient Greece competed naked, fully and deliberately. To the modern mind, it might seem shocking, but to the ancient Greeks, the unclothed body was not something to hide. It was something to celebrate. Strength, symmetry, and discipline weren't just physical traits. They were reflections of the virtue of the soul made visible. Competing nude wasn't just allowed, it was expected. It was part of the ritual. The Greek word gymnos means naked. From it came gymnasium, the training ground, and later the gymnasium. To train the body was to train the mind. Athletes covered themselves in olive oil, not for vanity, but to showcase the form and reduce chafing during movement. Dust was often sprinkled over the oil to prevent slipping and to accentuate muscle definition. In this sacred setting, the human form became art, and it wasn't just about appearance. Competing naked symbolized equality. In the arena, wealth and social class were stripped away, literally. What remained was effort, discipline, and raw physical skill. The body became the only uniform, and excellence became the only rank. But this exposure also had a moral edge. For the Greeks, shame was not in nudity, but in cowardice, cheating, or weakness. To step onto the track, into the wrestling pit, or before the javelin line without clothing was a declaration. I have nothing to hide. It was a gesture of transparency, a boldness. The athlete placed himself before the gods and his people in complete honesty. Sculptures from this era reflect that reverence. Chiseled statues of runners, discus throwers, and wrestlers, often idealized, were not just decorations. They were symbols of the heroic spirit, frozen in marble for generations to study and admire. Even the gods themselves, Apollo, Heracles, were depicted in the same heroic nudity. Women, of course, were excluded not only from competing, but even from watching. Only unmarried girls were allowed as spectators, and even that was rare. The Olympic space was wholly male, sacred, exposed, and competitive. In this environment, nudity wasn't indecent. It was divine. The naked athlete stood as a living offering, a body trained, tested, and transformed, not for glory alone, but for the favor of Zeus. In the first Olympic Games, there were no second chances. Only one man could win. There were no silver medals, no podium with 3 tiers. The Greeks believed that excellence was singular, victory was absolute, and so in every event, only the first-place athlete was honored, crowned with a simple yet sacred reward, a wreath of wild olive leaves cut from a holy tree near the temple of Zeus. The olive wreath, called a kotinos, held no monetary value. It wasn't gold, didn't sparkle, and couldn't be traded. But it meant something greater. It was a gift from the gods, a living symbol of immortal glory. To win in Olympia meant having your name recorded for all time. It meant returning to your polis as a hero. Your statue might be erected in the sanctuary. Poets might write verses in your name. Cities sometimes offer their champions lifetime privileges, free meals, theater seats, or public office. But the games weren't about prizes. They were about arete, a Greek concept of virtue and excellence. To possess arete was to fulfill your purpose, to perform at the height of human potential. And for athletes, that meant winning, nothing less. The competitions were fierce. Victory was not just personal. It was political. Each athlete represented his city-state. A win at Olympia reflected not just his own strength, but the strength and honor of his people. The glory belonged to all that made victory even more vital and defeat even more bitter. There was no room for excuses, no do-overs. The line between eternal fame and total obscurity could be measured in a breath, a stumble, a single moment of hesitation. And for those who didn't win, there were no commemorations, no odes. They returned home quietly, often forgotten by history. But the victor, he stood apart. Crowned in silence, his wreath catching the light, he became part of something sacred. The Greeks believed that such men were touched by the divine. They had not just outrun their rivals, they had pleased the gods. In a world without medals or sponsorships, this single fragile crown of olive leaves meant everything, because for the Greeks, immortality didn't come from wealth. It came from being remembered. The very first Olympic Games, held in 776 BCE, featured only a single event, a sprint known as the Stadion. It was a foot race, roughly 192 meters long, the length of the stadium itself. There were no starting blocks, no shoes, no false start penalties, just bare feet on packed earth, a straight line marked between two posts and silence before the judge's signal. The runners leaned forward, dust rose, and then they ran. The first recorded Olympic champion in history was a cook named Koroibos of Elise, a humble man whose name would echo for thousands of years simply because he ran the fastest once. His prize? Not money, not power. Just a wreath of olive leaves and a place in the eternal scroll of Olympic victors. Over time, the games grew. By the 7th century BCE, new events were added. The Diolos, a double-length race, the Dolichos, a long-distance run. Then came wrestling, discus, javelin, and the long jump. All parts of the brutal pentathlon, an event testing total physical ability to win. You had to be not just fast, but strong, agile, and clever. One of the most awe-inspiring additions was the pancration, a deadly blend of wrestling and boxing with almost no rules. Anything was allowed except biting and eye gouging. Men left the arena bloodied and broken. Some even died. But if you won, you were unstoppable, a living legend. And then came the chariot races. Thundering hooves around the hippodrome, dust clouds rising, wheels shattering, horses and drivers tumbling. These races were dangerous, chaotic, and wildly popular. They weren't driven by the athletes themselves, but by hired charioteers. Yet the owner of the horses, not the driver, was awarded the crown. Status mattered, but in 776 BCE it was just that first foot race, one event. One victor, one beginning. And yet, from that single competition, a movement was born. One that celebrated the physical form as divine, that pushed the body beyond comfort and transformed sport into something more than a game. It became a ritual. It became an honor. And as the years passed and new events were added, the original race, the Stadion, remained the heartbeat of the Games because everything Olympian began with a single sprint. The Olympic Games were not just competitions. They were ceremonies. Every race, every throw, every moment of exertion unfolded under the gaze of the gods. In Olympia, sport was sacred, and at its heart stood Zeus, ruler of Mount Olympus and the divine patron of the Games. Before the contests began, a great sacrifice was held at the altar of Zeus. This wasn't symbolic. It was central. Dozens of oxen were slaughtered in honor of the god, their ashes piled high on an altar made entirely from the remains of past sacrifices. This mound of sacred ash had grown over centuries, fed by the devotion of athletes and priests alike. To compete in Olympia, athletes had to swear a solemn oath in the temple of Zeus. With hands upon a piece of boar's flesh, they promised to train honestly, to compete fairly, and to bring no shame to the games. Cheating was not just dishonorable, it was sacrilege. Those who broke their oath could be fined, beaten, or permanently banned. Their names might be etched onto statues of Zanes, bronze effigies of Zeus placed at the entrance of the stadium as a warning. Here are the ones who dishonored the gods. Presiding over the games were the Hellanodiki, judges chosen from the region of Elise. They weren't mere referees. They were priestly figures, guardians of both the rules and the rituals. They trained for 10 months before the games, learning not only athletic standards but also religious protocols. They wore purple robes and carried staffs, symbols of their sacred authority. And then there was the Temple of Zeus itself, one of the largest and most majestic in the Greek world. Inside stood a statue over 40 feet tall, crafted by the sculptor Phidias, made of ivory and gold, seated on a throne, holding a scepter and a figure of Nike. The god watched over the games with a calm, eternal gaze. It was so magnificent, it would later be named one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Every leap, every strike, every drop of sweat was a form of worship. At Olympia, the body moved in rhythm with the divine. Victory wasn't just for pride, it was for Zeus. In ancient Olympia, the air was filled with competition, ritual, and the scent of olive oil. But one thing was conspicuously absent: women. The Olympic Games were an all-male affair, not only in competition but also in attendance. Married women were strictly forbidden from watching the games. The penalty, according to legend, was death specifically, being thrown off Mount Tyson. It was a reflection of the deeply patriarchal structure of Greek society, where public life, especially in athletic and sacred spaces, was the domain of men. The games celebrated the ideal male form. Nudity was standard, and the competitions were not just athletic, they were philosophical. The male body, trained and disciplined, was seen as a reflection of cosmic order, a living sculpture of virtue. Women, especially married women, had no place in this visual and symbolic environment. Still, not all women were excluded from the Olympic story. Unmarried women were occasionally allowed to watch, and they had their own event, the Heraean Games, held in honor of Hera, the wife of Zeus. These games featured foot races for young girls held in the same stadium, but with key differences. The races were shorter. The girls ran clothed, wearing short kittens that left one shoulder bare. Their hair was worn loose, unbound and free. The victors received olive crowns and were allowed to dedicate statues to Hera. But while the Heraean Games were meaningful, they were not the Olympics. The Olympic Games remained a sacred male ritual bound to Zeus and military values. Strength, endurance, and glory were cultivated for the battlefield as much as the arena. To be an Olympic victor was to be a hero of the polis, a role Greek women were simply not allowed to assume. There is one curious exception, the case of Caniska of Sparta, a wealthy woman who bred horses, because chariot races awarded the crown to the owner, not the driver. Caniska technically became the first female Olympic champion, but even she never set foot in the stadium to witness her victory. The exclusion of women wasn't just custom, it was religious law, social code, and cultural identity wrapped into one. In Olympia, the games were many things, but they were not for women. In ancient Greece, a victory at Olympia was more than personal triumph. It was political capital. To win was to bring honor not just to oneself, but to one's polis, the home city-state. Every athlete stood as a living emblem of where he came from. A victory in the Olympic Games meant superiority and strength, discipline, and divine favor, and that superiority reflected on the society that raised him. When an Olympic victor returned home, he was welcomed as a hero. City gates were opened in his honor, crowds lined the streets. Songs were sung. His name might be carved into stone or etched into local memory by poets. One of the most famous was Pindar, who composed elaborate victory odes, rich in language and myth, commissioned by cities to immortalize their champions. But the celebration didn't end with applause. Victors were often rewarded with gifts, land, money, free meals for life, tax exemptions, or even statues in the public square. In some cities, they were given prime seats at the theater or front rows at political gatherings. They might be elected to office, not because of their words, but because of their body and what it had proven in Olympia. Some wealthy elites used the Olympics to elevate their status. They funded training programs, sponsored athletes, or even bred horses for the chariot races where the owner, not the driver, claimed the prize. For these aristocrats, an Olympic win was like winning an election. It cemented their legacy, increased their influence, and shaped how history would remember them. Even rivalries between city-states played out through sport. When Athens and Sparta clashed politically or militarily, They also watched each other closely in the arena. Who had more victors? Who trained harder? Which polis did the gods seem to favor? Victory was a message. We are stronger people. Our way of life is the better path. In this way, the Olympic Games became a stage for diplomacy, a battlefield of symbolic war where cities competed for glory without drawing blood. The olive wreath may have looked humble, but in the world of ancient Greece, it carried the weight of political power, cultural pride, and immortal memory for over 1,000 years. The Olympic Games burned bright in ancient Greece. Every 4 years, without fail, athletes, poets, priests, and spectators made the journey to Olympia, not for profit, but for glory, devotion, and unity. But nothing in history is eternal. In 393 CE, the Christian Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree that brought the ancient games to an end. To him, they were a pagan ritual, incompatible with the growing dominance of Christianity in the Roman world. Temples were shuttered, altars dismantled, statues defaced. The sacred flame of Zeus was extinguished. The stadium fell silent. Centuries passed. The site of Olympia became ruins, slowly buried by time and earth. Nature reclaimed the track. The voices faded. The names of champions were forgotten, except by a few scribes who recorded their victories in dusty scrolls. And yet the idea never truly died. In the 19th century, as archaeologists uncovered the bones of Olympia, its columns, temples, and training grounds, interest stirred again. What if the games could return, not just as a curiosity, but as a global symbol? In 1896, the vision became reality. The modern Olympic Games were born in Athens, reimagined by Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who believed that sport could bring nations together in peace, just as it once brought Greeks together at Olympia. He borrowed many of the old traditions, the four-year cycle, the flame, the procession of athletes. Even the ideal of a rate, excellence of body and spirit, was revived. Today, the Olympic torch is lit in Olympia, in the shadow of the ruined temple of Hera, using a parabolic mirror and the rays of the sun, just as it might have been in ancient days. From there, it travels across continents, a flame that connects past to present. And though the modern games are global, commercial, and competitive on a massive scale, their heart still beats with an ancient rhythm, a celebration of human potential, of peace, of striving for something higher than victory alone from the sacred soil of Olympia. To stadiums around the world, the Olympic spirit continues, not as a relic, but as a living tradition. The sacred fire was never truly extinguished. It was passed on. The tale of the Colossus doesn't begin with bronze or artistry. It begins with a siege and with a city that refused to fall in 305 BCE. The island of Rhodes found itself under siege by one of the most feared military minds of the Hellenistic world, Demetrius Theus of Macedon, also known as the Besieger. He arrived with an army tens of thousands strong, backed by warships, catapults, and an infamous siege tower called the Helepolis, a mobile fortress 9 stories high. Rhodes, by contrast, was small, a proud naval city, wealthy through trade and skilled in diplomacy, but dwarfed by Demetrius's might. His goal was to crush Rhodes for its alliance with Egypt, the rival power of the Ptolemies. It should have been a short campaign. It wasn't. For nearly a year, the Rhodians held the line. They used their terrain, their walls, and their wits. At night, they snuck out to burn siege equipment. They cut off supply routes. They adapted faster than Demetrius could adjust. Even when the massive Helepolis rolled toward the city, they found a way to disable it, drenching it with oil and setting it alight. Eventually, the siege collapsed. Demetrius withdrew, humiliated, leaving behind his war machines and shattered pride. The city was spared. Its people, though scarred, were unbroken, and now they wanted to make sure no one ever forgot. The Rhodians gathered the remains of the siege, abandoned towers, broken catapults, and thousands of pounds of bronze and iron. These would not go to waste. They would be melted, reforged, and reborn, not into weapons, but into a monument. To mark their improbable victory, they chose to honor their patron deity, Helios, god of the sun. They would build him a statue, not ordinary, not even grand, but colossal, something the world had never seen. They commissioned Charis of Lindos, a sculptor known for his precision and ambition. He promised not just a statue, but a symbol, something that would say in no uncertain terms, Rhodes stands tall, Rhodes stands free. And so, from the ashes of war, the vision of the Colossus began, not as a wonder, but as an act of defiance. With victory still fresh and pride swelling in their hearts, the people of Rhodes turned their attention to a project unlike any the world had ever seen. They would build a statue not just to commemorate their resistance, but to send a message across the seas, a message cast in bronze and rooted in stone. They chose to honor Helios, the sun god, whom they believed had protected their city during the siege in Rhodes. Helios wasn't a distant celestial being. He was a guardian, a presence woven into the identity of the island. His rays shone on every harbor stone, and now he would be given form. To bring that vision to life, they summoned Charis of Lindos, a native Rhodian and a master sculptor. Charis had trained under Lysippos, the famed sculptor of Alexander the Great. He understood proportion, symmetry, and ambition. The task before him was monumental. The Colossus would stand over 100 feet tall, nearly the height of a modern 10-story building. It would be made entirely of bronze with a supporting structure of iron and stone. The materials came from the very siege machines Demetrius had left behind. Thousands of pounds of bronze from melted-down weapons and armor would become the skin of the god. What had once threatened Rhodes would now protect it. Construction began around 292 BCE, and it would take 12 years to complete. The process was slow and deliberate. The statue was likely built from the ground up, with each section carefully cast, assembled and reinforced as the structure rose. Workers toiled in the blazing sun, shaping metal, aligning joints, and creating what would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. We don't know exactly what it looked like. No ancient images survive. Let's believe Helios stood upright, perhaps with one hand shielding his eyes as he looked east, or with an arm raised in triumph, his face calm, his crown a radiant halo of sunbeams. It wasn't just art. It wasn't just religion. It was an identity. Forged from the relics of war, the Colossus of Rhodes was more than a statue. It was a reminder to all who entered the harbor that this city stood unshaken and that its light would not be dimmed. When the Colossus was finally completed, sometime around 280 BCE, it was not merely a statue. It was a revelation. Standing more than 30 meters tall, the Colossus of Rhodes was the tallest statue of the ancient world. Constructed entirely of bronze plates over an internal skeleton of iron and stone, it dominated the skyline of Rhodes and astonished every visitor who sailed into the harbor. Though later myths would claim it straddled the harbor entrance with ships passing between its legs, historians and engineers agree this would have been structurally impossible. Instead, the statue most likely stood to the side of the harbor, perhaps atop a stone pedestal where it could be seen from afar, its bronze body gleaming in the sun, its crown of radiating spikes echoing the sun god's divine rays. The engineering behind it was nothing short of extraordinary. Each bronze plate was carefully shaped and fitted, locked into a hidden framework that kept the giant stable. Weights were distributed evenly. Joints were concealed. The statue may have been built using earthen ramps, which were raised gradually as construction climbed upward, then removed once the final section was complete. The figure of Helios likely stood in a calm, upright pose. One hand resting by his side, the other raised, perhaps in salute or holding a torch. His face was serene, youthful, and idealized, as was the Greek artistic tradition. His gaze would have been cast across the sea, watching over sailors and merchants as they entered the harbor of Rhodes. But the Colossus was more than just a guardian. He was a symbol to Rhodians. Helios embodied freedom, resilience, and divine favor. His towering form announced to the world that Rhodes had not only survived the siege, but emerged greater. The city had taken the weapons of war and turned them into a monument of peace. Visitors stood in awe. The statue wasn't just tall, it seemed eternal. The sunlight danced across his bronze surface, his shadow stretched across the harbor walls, and for a moment, standing beneath him, one could almost believe the gods walked among men. In Helios, Rhodes had built its pride and set it in bronze. For 12 shining years, the Colossus stood not just as a statue, but as a signal fire to the ancient world, announcing a new era for Rhodes. The city, long a crossroads of cultures and commerce, now found itself basking in international admiration. With the bronze form of Helios rising above its harbor, Rhodes became a beacon, both literal and symbolic, to visiting merchants, envoys, and poets. The Colossus declared that this island was more than a naval stronghold. It was a rising cultural force. The presence of the statue transformed public identity. The Rhodians saw themselves not merely as survivors of siege, but as chosen people, protected by the sun god, elevated by victory, destined for greatness. Helios wasn't just a god they worshipped in temples. He was now a presence, casting his gaze from the skyline. The image of the Colossus soon appeared on Rhodian coins, minted and traded across the Mediterranean. Helios, crowned with rays, became a mark of Rhodian pride and prosperity. Inscriptions celebrating the Colossus began to circulate. Travelers wrote of the way the sun seemed to reflect off his bronze skin at dawn, painting the harbor in golden light. Culturally, Rhodes flourished. The city became a hub for philosophers, sculptors, and orators. Schools of rhetoric were founded. Statues lined the agora. Art, politics, and religion merged into a refined civic identity, with the Colossus at its center. But the statue's meaning extended beyond the borders of Rhodes. It stood as a universal emblem of resilience in the face of impossible odds. The statue forged from enemy weapons, dedicated to a god of light, visible to all who sailed the sea. It reminded people across the Hellenistic world that strength could be sculpted from suffering, that peace, once secured, could be shaped into beauty. For some, the Colossus represented divine harmony, a city and a deity in perfect alignment. For others, it was proof that even in an age of war and conquest, something could be built that inspired rather than destroyed. And for the Rhodians, it was simply theirs, their triumph, their god, their skybound promise. The Colossus wasn't just a wonder, it was hope in bronze. In 226 BCE, just over a decade after the Colossus was completed, the ground beneath Rhodes began to tremble. Without warning, a massive earthquake struck the island. Homes collapsed, temples cracked open, the harbor walls shuddered, and then, with a groan of metal and a cry from the heavens, the mighty statue of Helios, the pride of the city, snapped at the knees and fell. The Colossus did not simply tip over like a tree. It broke piece by piece, twisting as it descended. The legs crumbled first, and the upper body slammed into the earth, shattering sections of bronze. Fingers the size of men splintered. The head, once gazing out to sea, now lay face down in the dust. No one had expected it, and no one could stop it. The damage to Rhodes was severe, but nothing struck the people more deeply than the loss of their god's image. The Colossus had become more than a statue. It was a companion, a symbol of divine favor. Now it lay in ruin. Its wreckage sprawled across the city's sacred ground, and yet, even in ruin, it remained a marvel. 4 centuries after the quake, travelers still came to see what was left. The historian Strabo wrote of the fallen Colossus, describing the sheer size of its remains. Visitors stood in the shadow of its broken limbs and marveled at the engineering it had once required. The fingers were thicker than a man's torso. The ribs of bronze curled like forgotten armor. Inside they saw the iron framework and the brilliant design of a civilization determined to defy its enemies. Some said the fall was a punishment from the gods. Others believed it was a reminder that even glory must bow to nature. But most Rhodians, though heartbroken, refused to erase it. The Colossus, though broken, was still sacred. They left the pieces where they fell. And for the next 800 years, those fragments remained silent, rusting, enormous, a fallen god, a shattered wonder, yet somehow more human in its brokenness than it had ever been in perfection. The statue had once represented strength. Now it whispered of impermanence, and that too was something sacred after the dust of the earthquake settled and the grief faded into silence. The question rose like morning fog over Rhodes. Should we rebuild it? The fallen Colossus still lay scattered across the ground, its bronze skin gleaming in the sunlight, its broken limbs stretched like a sleeping giant along the earth. Many citizens wanted it restored. It was, after all, their symbol, their guardian, their pride. But others hesitated, and so, as they had many times before, the Rhodians turned to a voice older than their city, the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle's response was chilling. The gods had spoken, she said. The fall of the Colossus was no accident. It was a sign Helios was displeased, and rebuilding the statue would provoke further divine wrath. The Rhodians, deeply spiritual and cautious not to offend their patron deity, took the warning seriously. They abandoned the idea. But there were also practical reasons. Rebuilding a statue of such scale would have required enormous resources, materials, labor, time. The original Colossus had taken 12 years to construct. Its cost had been underwritten by the spoils of war and donations from allies. But now the economic climate is different. The political landscape was more unstable. Rhodes faced new threats and shifting alliances. Rebuilding a statue, no matter how iconic, didn't seem wise in such uncertain times, and so the decision was made. Let it rest. For centuries afterward, the Colossus remained in pieces, but it was never forgotten. The fragments became a kind of outdoor museum. Pilgrims and poets, traders and scholars all came to see the ruins. They walked among the statue's massive ribs. They placed hands on its outstretched fingers. They marveled at its shattered face. There was awe even in destruction, and perhaps that's why Rhodes never lifted it again. Because sometimes a fallen wonder speaks louder than a standing one. Sometimes ruin becomes a kind of memory, one that humbles, teaches, and lingers longer than glory. The Rhodians didn't rebuild because they didn't need to. The Colossus had already done its job. It had become legend. And legends once born don't need bronze to stand. Though the Colossus had fallen, its fame only grew. As centuries passed, the broken statue became legendary, not despite its destruction, but because of it. Travelers from across the Mediterranean continued to visit Rhodes, not to see a standing monument, but to witness a ruined wonder. The Greek historian Strabo, writing nearly 2 centuries later, described the remains in vivid detail. He spoke of bronze fingers longer than a man, hollow limbs as large as towers, and a shattered torso that still held the shape of a god. Even in fragments, the Colossus stirred awe. It became a place of reflection, proof that even the greatest works could break. What stood before visitors was no longer a statue, but a ghost of greatness, lying in state beneath the sun. Unlike other wonders of the world, the Colossus wasn't destroyed by war or hatred. It hadn't been toppled by invaders or melted down in rage. It had been brought low by nature. An earthquake, blind and impartial, reminding humanity of its limits. Still, the remains were treated with reverence. The Rhodians never melted them down, never swept them away. They left the ruins where they fell, letting time and wind and memory weave them into something sacred. In the ancient world, the 7 wonders were not just lists, they were pilgrimages and roads. Though its statue lay in pieces, became one of those sacred destinations. Alongside the towering lighthouse of Alexandria and the hanging gardens of Babylon, the broken Colossus held its place. It was different, more somber, more human. Other wonders dazzled with grandeur. The Colossus now inspired something quieter, tinged with melancholy. It showed the passage of time. It whispered of ambition, fragility, and the strange beauty of collapse. It taught a truth that perfection could not, that even fallen things can be remembered, that sometimes the pieces left behind are more powerful than the whole. So the visitors kept coming. They stood among the ruins. They traced the edges of bronze with their fingers, and they imagined the day when Helios once looked down upon the harbor, radiant and unshaken. The wonder still existed. It had simply changed shape. For over 8 centuries, the broken Colossus lay where it fell, weathered by sun and wind, admired by pilgrims and poets. Generation after generation stood in its shadow, imagining the towering figure it once had been. And then, just like that, it disappeared. In 654 CE, Rhodes was invaded by an army of the Umayyad Caliphate, a rising Islamic power that swept across the eastern Mediterranean. The city fell, and with it, the last visible remnants of the Colossus. According to later Byzantine chroniclers, the conquerors saw the statue's vast ruins as a source of material, not memory. The bronze was said to have been melted down and sold to a traveling Syrian merchant, who transported it away, piece by piece, carted off on the backs of 900 camels. Whether that number was exaggerated or not, the message was clear. The Colossus of Rhodes was gone. No more fragments, no more limbs or ribs to touch, no more towering bones of a fallen god. The statue that had once watched over the harbor, that had stood for resistance and identity, now existed only in words. And yet those words were powerful. Writers continued to record it as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, placing it alongside monuments that still stood. Temples, pyramids, tombs. The Colossus, despite being physically absent, lived on in the world's collective imagination. Its image transformed across cultures. Medieval maps showed it straddling the harbor, a gate of bronze that ships passed beneath. Renaissance artists painted it as a titan. Casting shadows across oceans, it became a symbol of what once was and what could be again. The irony is that we know so little about what it actually looked like. There are no surviving blueprints, no surviving sculptures or carvings. Everything we believe about the Colossus comes from the echoes of travelers, the pages of historians, and the imagination of those who came too late. But perhaps that's what makes it eternal, because the Colossus of Rhodes was never just a statue. It was a dream cast in metal, a vision of what humanity could build when courage, beauty, and purpose aligned. And while its body may be gone, its shadow still stretches across time. The Colossus of Rhodes no longer stands, but its meaning has never collapsed. More than 2,000 years after its fall, it remains etched in the world's imagination. Not as rubble, not as loss, but as a symbol. It was never just about height or engineering or bronze. It was about what people saw when they looked up at it. Strength and defiance, beauty and resilience, pride made visible. Built from the spoils of war, the Colossus began as a declaration that Rhodes, though small, could not be broken. Its people turned the tools of siege into art. What was once meant to destroy them became a monument to their endurance, and that idea has outlived the statue itself. Across history, echoes of the Colossus have surfaced again and again. When France gifted the Statue of Liberty to the United States, it wasn't just a gesture of diplomacy. It was a tribute to the same ideal that a towering figure by the harbor could welcome the world and stand for something greater than stone or steel in modern times. Engineers and artists have proposed rebuilding the Colossus. Some imagine a new statue with solar panels to honor Helios in a sustainable form. Others envision a modern wonder of glass and light hovering above the sea. None have come to pass. But the fact that we still dream of rebuilding it says everything, because the Colossus represents more than its own history. It represents the kind of monument humanity longs to build, not to kings or conquests, but to possibility, to the idea that out of devastation, something radiant can rise, to the belief that even when toppled, the spirit of a people remains. In every shattered empire, in every rising city, in every monument built after war, in every torch held aloft at the edge of a harbor, the Colossus still stands. It stands in stories, in symbols, and in the space between who we are and what we dare to build. Rhodes may be quiet now, but in the minds of those who remember, a god of bronze still watches the waves, and even broken he shines.